Lucia. I'll be your host. And I'm joined by Rita Peters, who is my co-host, but she is also the Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs. Rita, how are you?
I'm great. I'm excited to be doing this, live broadcast, and we've got another committee hearing today. I can't wait to see it happen.
I can't wait to see it too. In just a few moments, Rita, we're expecting a hearing in the New Hampshire Committee on State and Federal Relations and Veteran Affairs. They're considering our Article 5 Convention of States legislation. So it's going to be referred to as HCR1. Again, our bill within our resolution within the committee is called HCR1. So the Convention of States co-founder and senior advisor, Michael Farris, is on the ground, and he is ready to testify in favor of our Article 5 application. And just to get you caught up, we've passed our application in 19 states. And our Article 5 application covers 3 topics: fiscal restraints, term limits for elected officials, and then also jurisdiction issues between the federal government and the states. We need 34 to get to a convention, so just 15 more states need to pass our Article 5 resolution, and we will get to a convention. There are several states this legislative session that are considering our Article 5 convention or our Article 5 application. Currently, there are 12 that have introduced the resolution, including Illinois, Iowa, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, New Hampshire, New Mexico, New York, Rhode Island, Virginia, Washington, and Wyoming. All of them are expected to, at some point, bring up a hearing, and they all are based on our Article 5 application language. So with all of that, Rita, I want to ask you a question before we get going. How did we get to this point here in New Hampshire?
Well, it's all about the grassroots, Andrew. The Convention of States New Hampshire volunteer team has been busy building support across the state and in the legislature. They've held meetings to get the word out and to organize. We've had about 12,000 New Hampshire residents sign the Convention of States petition. That's a lot for such a small state. But they're asking their state legislators to vote yes for COS because, of course, Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution puts the power in the hands of the states acting through their state legislatures to apply for a convention to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. That's, of course, what we're all about. We need to rein in the federal government, and this is the way to do it. New Hampshire citizens see that and are asking their state legislators to support our effort. And the first step in the process in New Hampshire starts today, really, with the committee hearing in the House. Now, I want to say just a word about New Hampshire in particular. It's actually been a really tough state for us. And part of the reason is because they have the biggest House of Representatives of all the states in the union, Andrew. They have 400 representatives. So it's a major effort for the people of New Hampshire to contact that many representatives, get them educated about Convention of States, and explain why they need to support this effort. But our volunteers are working hard to do that. And again, we're here because that box at the bottom of your screen is going to, at 1:30 p.m., it'll come on with a live stream of the New Hampshire committee hearing where our resolution is going to be heard. And as you said, Senior Advisor Michael Farris is there to testify. Andrew, I spoke with Al, our New Hampshire State Director, earlier today, and he's really excited to be there at the Capitol today and is expecting a pretty big turnout of New Hampshire COS volunteers. So I'm excited to see them there, see them testify. And for our viewers, want to let you know that you should stay tuned after the vote if you can, because we will have a recap. At least Andrew will still be here for a recap and to explain exactly what happened. Now, we don't expect the committee to vote today in New Hampshire. They generally vote at a later meeting, but could happen as early as next week. So what happens in this committee hearing today is really important. And I bet by just listening to the kinds of questions that the committee members are asking. It'll give us pretty good insight into where they stand. And Andrew, I can tell you this committee is 10 Republicans and 9 Democrats. That's the composition. Of course, we don't know that they will all be present today in the committee room, but that's what we're looking at. So I'm excited to get started. What are some of the things you expect to happen in this committee hearing, Andrew?
Well, I am excited to see how many people show up, how many grassroots supporters show up, because they're the lifeblood of what we do at Convention of States. Our grassroots activists, our district captains, our volunteers, and all of our supporters, they are what actually drive this push to call the very first Article 5 Convention of States. And so I'm excited to see them. We saw so many activists and volunteers show up for the Montana hearing. And as you know, and as many of our viewers probably know, that hearing was very successful, and the committee moved that out of, passed it out of that committee. So that, and you have to attribute so much of that to our grassroots volunteers and all of the hard work that they've put in year after year in Montana. And same here in New Hampshire. They've put so much work year after year after year to get to this point right now. And it's always so encouraging to see them show up. And, you know, if we have a minute or two before we go live to this hearing, but I'm wondering if you can just give a few comments, Rita, about that hearing that we saw in Montana, and how we are seeing early victories for Convention of States in just the first, month into legislative session.
Yeah, well, Andrew, as you pointed out, we did have that Montana Senate Committee on Business, Labor, and Economic Affairs vote earlier this week, 6-4, to advance our Convention of States resolution. Now it goes to the full Montana Senate for a floor vote. Not sure yet exactly when that will happen, but that committee vote was our first committee victory of 2023. So it was really exciting. And we live streamed that committee hearing. And it is just so encouraging and inspiring to those of us on the national. Every time we watch one of those committee hearings and see our volunteers, it looks like the New Hampshire House State and Federal Relations and Veterans Affairs Committee might be getting started now. So let's go there and see if they're starting up. It looks like there's some movement. They're just getting ready. I guess we can keep talking until until we hear that gavel, Andrew. But it's so fun and so inspiring to hear our volunteers who show up for these hearings and explain to the committee members in a respectful and articulate and persuasive way why they want them to pass this resolution. It's because they care about the future of our country. And our viewers should keep in mind that most of these people are people who have jobs and families who are taking time away from their regular daily lives to do this important work
at this time,
of self-governance.
it being 1331 here in State, Federal, and Veterans, we'll call this hearing to order on House Concurrent Resolution 1. Prime sponsor is literally in the House, Representative Bernardi. Thank you for being here, and please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. For the record, my name is J.D. Bernardi. I represent Rockingham 36, 5 towns on the southeast border of New Hampshire: Kensington, Hampton Falls, Southampton, Newton, and Plastow. I'm from Southampton. I rise to present House Concurrent Resolution 1. Convention of States. Article 5 establishes 2 paths to create a constitutional amendment. Not a constitutional convention, but a constitutional amendment. Those 2 paths are either Congress or a convention of 2/3 of the states may propose an amendment. then 3/4 of the states in either route are required to ratify that amendment before it becomes an amendment, not a change, not a redo of the Constitution, but an amendment to the Constitution. Neither of these processes would be successful if the great will of the American people was not behind it. Polls have shown an overwhelming bipartisan support for the Convention of States subject matter. This resolution seeks a convention to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, commonly referred to as a balanced budget amendment, limit powers and jurisdictions of the federal government, and impose term limits on federal officials. The common tasking has been adopted by 19 other states to date. Again, there's overwhelming public support to address these issues. 55% of Democrats, 65% of independents, 75% of Republicans, when polled, agree that these resolutions need to be taken up. Yet Congress does not act. Why is that? It's not in their interest to limit their financial or personal power or time in office. This point received considerable discussion during the Philadelphia Convention, forming our nation. The need for state convention was proposed initially by Charles Pinckney at the very start of the Constitutional Convention process. A summary of the statements of Mason and Randolph, both representatives from Virginia, concurs. They say, where in short, Congress would not always be trusted to do what is in the best interest of the country, and that when it is the practice of Congress itself that gave rise to the need for amendments, some other body should be made available to the people to initiate changes to the Constitution. Federalist 51 addresses the need for checks and balances, separation of powers, but there also Madison writes, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. He further notes, should the provision of the Constitution, as here reviewed, be found not to secure the government and the rights of the states against usurpations and abuses on the part of the United States, the final resort within the Constitution lies in an amendment of the Constitution according to a process applicable by the states. Our contention is we have reached that point. We have reached the point where we need a convention of the states to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, to limit federal power, returning it to the states, and to establish term limits for federal officials. These are issues rightfully to be discussed in a convention. I'm open to any questions, but as you know, Chairman, we have several highly qualified candidates here, including Michael Ferris, one of the co-founders of the Convention of States organization, and many others. So I'll answer whatever questions you have, but they may be better suited.
Questions for the Prime? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Representative. There are questions that will come up about a runaway convention. I'm not going to, I know some of us have that question. I'm not going to have it posed now. I know it's going to be addressed in a bit. What we're going to do here is, typically our tradition is if we have sitting reps who are looking to testify, we try to get them up to the front. There were also a couple of people who came a long way and have to leave early, so I'm going to get them up to the front as well. We have 20 plus folks who would like to speak, which is great. It's great to see this turnout here. I would ask that when it comes your turn to speak, and we very much want to hear everybody speak, that's why we're here. If some of the points that you wanted to make have been made before, you don't need to repeat them necessarily. So, and I noticed on the cards, many of you have only asked for 1 minute. which is wonderful if you can be that succinct and that organized. So all that said, I'd like to go to Mr. Michael Ferris, who is here from Virginia. Now, he's asked for 10+ minutes. If we can make that 10 minus minutes, Mr. Ferris. But we want you to, there he is. You came a long way. We want to, and you know this material. We want to hear what you have to say. So welcome to Historic Representatives Hall.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you so much for holding this wonderful meeting, this great room. This is terrific. When I was here before several years ago, we were downstairs in a much smaller room. This is terrific. Thank you for the opportunity. I am an attorney, been in practice since 1976, so that's getting close to 50 years. I've argued 2 cases, constitutional cases in the Supreme Court of the United States, and I've litigated the Article 5 issue in the past. In the late 1970s, when Congress tried to change the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, going from 7 years to 10.5 years, I represented several legislators from the state of Washington in a case that got consolidated together with a similar case in Idaho and Arizona, and worked together, and the net finding of that case was you can't change the rules in the middle of the stream. And that was the holding of the federal district court. It went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court made a summary ruling because the second deadline passed, and they held basically that the ERA had expired, and so that the prior decision stands as a persuasive but not binding precedent. But it's one of the more important precedents is Article 5, and so I'm one of the rare lawyers in the country that's actually litigated and researched on Article 5. In addition, and this is germane to the Runaway Convention, I've published an article in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy to definitively answer kind of the baseline question of whether or not the original Constitutional Convention was a runaway. I mean, the theory goes, well, they were only supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation, and instead they wrote a whole new document. That's the genesis of a lot of the arguments that raised about the Runaway Convention. It's just simply, historically, not true. As we all probably remember from our history, the Annapolis Convention was held previous to that. They'd been given, the delegates had been given responsibility by their various states, authority by their states, to discuss problems with commerce. We needed to have a different mechanism for regulating commerce. The delegates got together and said, we don't have enough authority to solve the real problems, and so they went back to their states and asked for more authority, and the authority they asked for was to render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. Several states started passing resolutions calling for a convention in May of 1787 in Philadelphia for that purpose, to render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. 6 states called for that convention, named their delegates, gave their delegates their various voting instructions, and then at that point, the Articles of Confederation, Congress passed the resolution that has the language, only amend the Articles of Confederation. That's where it comes from. It's from that congressional resolution. Now, when Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, wanted to communicate to the states and ask the states to do something, they had a process of passing 2 resolutions, the substantive resolution, and then they have voted and approved official letter of communication. Congress never passed a resolution of communication of the resolution because it wasn't intended as a request for the states. It was like a congressional resolution today endorsing National Pickle Week or something. It was expressing the beliefs of Congress about it, but it was not a binding document. We should all know that under the Articles of Confederation, the Articles of Confederation Congress had no residual or implied powers to do anything. They had no power to call a convention or anything else. And so after they gave their resolution, the rest of the states continued, and New Hampshire was one of them, continued, and New Hampshire told its delegates to render the federal Constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. And that's what they did. And this article goes into great detail to prove that the delegates officially obeyed their instructions, not only on subject matter, but on voting process as well. The delegates can be held to be faithful. New York, for example, said that all 3 delegates from their state that included Alexander Hamilton and Yates, one another man whose name's escaping me at the moment. The three of them all had to be present and voting for New York to cast its one state, one vote vote. And two of them got mad at the way things were going. They left. New York never voted again. So Alexander Hamilton never tried to cast the vote because that would be violating the standards that the state of New York set upon its delegates. The rules that states give their delegates have to be followed, and the historical precedent is absolutely without exception. So, and there's a similar answer, it takes a long time to explain, as to why the ratification process was proper as well. The short answer is the 1787 Constitutional Convention proposed two documents. The Constitution was one, and a methodology of ratification was a second. The Congress, under Articles of Confederation, unanimously approved the methodology only, didn't vote on the Constitution, sent it to the state legislatures. All 13 state legislatures approved the new ratification process, which is the way it had to be done under the Articles of Confederation. Congress and all 13 states had to approve any change of process. That's what happened. And then it was sent to the state ratification conventions. We all know that it ultimately got ratified. So the whole runaway convention mess is anti-historical, and frankly, it's defamatory of the Constitution of the United States. Because if it was a runaway convention, then the Constitution of the United States was illegally adopted. And I don't know why anybody would call themselves a constitutionalist. I don't know why anybody would swear an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States and contend it was illegally adopted. You are not a constitutionalist if you think it was illegally adopted. You are anti-constitutionalist by definition. And so the people that are spreading these rumors about a runaway convention do not know the law, do not know the history, and they're putting forth propaganda of people who have been enemies of the Constitution for years, and it's simply inappropriate. Now, why do we need this convention at this particular time? The sponsor gave you good reason, but I'll just say this. The reason that George Mason and others said that we need to give the states the authority to amend the Constitution is the federal government's going to abuse its power. Now, think if I have 10 kids, 29 grandkids, you take over America your way, I'll take over America my way. Think of what would happen if I never disciplined my 10 children. They would grow up not to be pretty rowdy and inappropriate. You couldn't trust what they were doing. Now, for over 200 years now, the parent, who are the states, have never used Article 5 to discipline the runaway of federal power. And this convention needs to be called to show the Congress, show the federal government, there are limits here. And we have the authority to change your mind. We have the authority to change your pattern of behavior. And the subject matters that we've given are limiting federal power. And for example, my personal favorite is to impose a single subject rule on Congress, to not let them pass the $1.7 trillion package bills where they throw everything under the sun into it. And that would not happen if you simply passed a single subject rule. What's going to come out of this convention like this is going to be something short, concise, and commonsensical like that. There might be two or three other things, but what we're doing in this stage of the process is setting the agenda for discussion. The agenda for discussion is fiscal restraints, term limits, not just on Congress, but on all federal officials, and other limitations on federal power. It's safe. We've litigated. We've done the historical research. If you have any questions, the article that I've given, Mr. Chairman, I'll give you my hard copy. All of the documents have been posted on your website or your link, so you all have access to it. And I would be glad to answer any questions that you have. Thank you for this time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ferris. Questions for Mr. Ferris? Representative Massimilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for taking my question. Could you explain to the people at home the difference between an Article 5 convention, a constitutional convention, and a convention of states?
Okay. Two of them are synonymous. An Article 5 convention and a convention of the states are the same thing. Two names for the exactly same thing. A constitutional convention is what you would do if you were trying to rewrite the document entirely. And in order to do that, we would basically have to do the revolutionary power under the Articles of the Declaration of Independence, where it says people get upset with the government, they have the authority to redo it. That's what you'd have to do to have a constitutional convention. To an amendments convention, there's an amendments convention in session right now. It's called Congress. And every day they're in session, they can propose amendments to the Constitution of the United States. And so this would be a convention where the states pick who's there, and the states get to control the agenda, not Congress. So the amendments are going to come from one place, and ultimately, for the resolution that we've proposed, it answers two questions. Who decides how much power the federal government should have? Should Congress decide how much power the federal government should have, or should the states, for this convention process, decide? And I think it's high time that the states say, we're going to do it ourselves. So our Article 5 convention states exactly the same thing. The founders called it a convention of states, and that's when I basically wrote the text that you've got before you. When writing that, that's why we called it that, because of the historical use by the founders.
Thank you.
Ms. Ferris, if this proposed convention were to occur, who would be the convener or the convening officer, and where would it be held? Who would determine where it would be held?
Well, when there are 34 states that call for a convention for the same purpose, now there are hundreds, probably about 500 current valid resolutions that call for a convention of the states on a lot of different topics. And they don't coalesce. And so the reason you can't have a runaway, you can't coalesce to call a convention, you can't change the subject matter at the convention either. But the Congress calls a convention, they would name the time, they would name at least the initial place that it meets. The convention itself, at that point in time, once they convene, could adjourn to another location. And so if, for example, they decide to put it in Washington, D.C., I don't think that's a particularly good idea. I think that there'd be a lot of momentum for moving to a different location outside the Beltway. And so, but the states themselves would decide the rules. There are a lot of states that are looking at passing a recommended rules package. And if enough states commit themselves to a particular rules package beforehand, it's like the Delegate Limitation Acts that a number of states are passing. And we are working on a complete rules package. Our organization has sponsored the Article 5 compendium. That has all the law. If you want a full compendium of all the law on the subject, we have it available for you. And we're working on a package of rules to make it happen. But in the meantime, probably the Mason's rules of legislative practice that would be in control.
Thank you. Other questions? Representative Carey.
I just want a clarification for the record. Who are you representing?
I represent the Convention of States.
Convention of States.
Precisely, Convention of States Action is the full name of the organization. Yeah.
And once again, you said this earlier, for those that are watching on the intranet or will watch later, you just gave us your organization. Is there a website, or you repeat where you said that information can be found?
The organization is Convention of States, cosaction.org, is that right? Or conventionofstates.org. Thank you. I founded it, but I've gone for 6 years. I was the president, CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom for the last 6 years, the largest conservative legal organization in the world. And so, but I've retired from being CEO. I get to actually be a lawyer again.
Other questions? Seeing none, I thank you for traveling here and for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Rebecca, if you, for our clerk's sake, could properly say your last name before you begin your testimony.
Rebecca Giambaresi, Giambarresi. I'm a resident of Salem, New Hampshire, and I am grateful for this opportunity to present my testimony to this Assembly in support of HCR 1. It is my deep conviction that America is now at a crossroads from which there could well be no return. We find ourselves once again living under a tyrannical central government, not unlike the one we threw off during the Revolution. Now is the time to reclaim our power as free and sovereign citizens. We as citizens at the time of our founding created our federal government. We created this body for the purpose of serving our several sovereign states by providing a national defense and making laws for the common good. Instead, we find ourselves burdened by heavy taxes and innumerable regulations, many of which do not serve the common good. Often our tax money is spent to institute initiatives which go against our deeply held beliefs, and our natural rights to free speech and self-defense are being threatened. For these and many other reasons, we citizens, working through our state legislators, need to rein in the federal government by proposing amendments to our original Constitution for this purpose. We don't want to change our Constitution. We love our Constitution. And I gave the same example as Mr. Ferris, so I won't repeat it. New Hampshire has an opportunity to become the 20th state to call for an Article 5 Convention of States for the purpose of taking our sovereignty back as free American citizens. It is not our goal to change our Constitution, but to see that the original structure of our government, which is proposed therein, is reinstated and preserved for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Would you like to take any questions, or if there are any? Seeing no questions, thank you so much. Okay, we have one more testifier I'd like to get up front, and then we'll go right to a few legislators who'd like to speak, and that would be Samuel Fieldman. Samuel, representing Wolf Pack. That's PAC, Wolf Pack.
Thank you. My name is Samuel Fieldman. I'm National Counsel for Wolfpack. I'm testifying neutral on this resolution today, but I'm testifying because I have an expertise in the Article 5 Convention process. What I'm passing out to you right now is the same thing that I gave you last week when I testified on a different bill. I'm not going to talk about that in my testimony, but I want you to have that available as a quick reference guide for the plethora of misinformation that I'm sure you will hear about some of the views of the founders and other scholars. You can refer to the quotes that are often misquoted in great detail and in context there with links to the original sources. Mr. Ferris gave a very good background on the theoretical reasons why we know that an Article 5 convention can be limited, and that is important. But the main thing that I want to talk to you about today are the practical tools that allow for that enforcement to be in effect, and the reason why we know that we can trust the process to ensure that will happen. The way the founders wrote the Constitution, they created a system of checks and balances and a distribution of power between state and federal government and different bodies, and that creates what I call a safety net around the Article 5 Convention process. Not every protection is written specifically into Article 5 as an explicit protection. Instead, they're written into the nature of how the government itself works, how Article 5 works, how the entire process works. And the four main bodies that have some ability and some authority to provide for that safety net are the courts, the Congress, the delegates, and the states. And I want to tell you right up front, I don't trust the courts, and I don't trust the Congress, and I don't trust the delegates, and I don't trust the states. What I trust is that network, that safety net of all of those working together in contention, because it only takes one of them to enforce the limitations over the others, to disagree with the others, in order to prevent the process from leading to an amendment on another issue. And that's why when I said to you last week, 100% of peer-reviewed scholars agree that there's no way a new limited Article 5 convention call, like the one before you today, could possibly lead to an amendment on another issue. There is an enormous body of legal research on each of these different protections that explains how the process can be limited and why we know that, that the enforcement mechanisms can and will remain in place. So first for the courts, the courts have checks and balances over several other parts of the process. There are a number of different types of conventions under the US Constitution and under the states, and all of them have, each one of them is unique. They all have some bearing on understanding how other types of conventions work. And Florida, as a state, happens to have a state convention that is very analogous to the Article 5 convention process. Every 20 years, they have a convention that's limited specifically to budgetary issues under their constitution. The convention meets only to propose amendments, which then get sent on to the states. In 2008, that convention met, and they proposed some amendments that the delegates believed were within their powers, but some other people did not agree, and they sued, and the case was called Ford v. Browning. The state Supreme Court in Florida agreed that some of the amendments were fine and could be sent on for ratification. Other amendments were outside of the scope, and they enforced the delegate limitation rules that were in place in this analogous convention in Florida and did not allow those to be sent on for ratification. There are also ways that the court system has powered over the checks that Congress has, has checks over the power Congress has in place. There's cases such as Powell v. McCormick, which show the Congress able to use the Declaratory Judgment Act to make it as if Congress acted in a situation where Congress has refused to do its ministerial duty of calling for a convention. In Powell v. McCormick, it was a different duty, obviously. It was a duty to seat a member of Congress and pay him his salary. They could not make Congress act, but in that case, they made it as if Congress had done what they were supposed to do, and therefore, the clerk of Congress had to pay Representative Powell his salary by virtue of that act. There are also the case that I mentioned last week, which was just in 2020, unanimous by the Supreme Court, Ciafalo v. Washington, which enforced delegate limitation procedures. Those procedures, in that particular case, it was in reference to the Electoral College, but that same exact provision was copied virtually verbatim from delegate limitation instructions from Article 5 Ratification Convention in New Mexico from 1933, and that concept came originally from Bascoen? I'm sure I'm saying Bascoen. Sorry, I mispronounced it last time, and I appreciate Representative Carey correcting me on that. It came from concepts that were there, as well as in numerous other states. The Congress has its role to play as well. Congress is given the authority both to call the convention upon receiving the sufficient number of applications, and we've seen Congress, despite having hundreds of applications, has not exercised a call, and that is because, presumably, depending on who you ask, they don't, for those who believe that different calls cannot be counted together, as I do, that's because they've not had 34 on any one subject matter. For those who believe that different calls can be counted together in some ways, then that's because Congress has not done its duty. And if you are in that latter camp, which I am not, then a new Article 5 convention call on a different subject matter is irrelevant because the duty has already been triggered. So whichever way you go and whichever camp you agree with, whether you agree with me or not on that issue, either way, a new Article 5 convention call could not trigger a convention that could lead to an amendment on any other subject. Congress also has the power to regulate the convention process. There have been numerous bills introduced in Congress over the years. It's passed the Senate unanimously twice. I'm going to talk in more detail next week when I come back to talk about regulations about Senator Chuck Schumer and President Biden's views that they've expressed on those kinds of regulations. They were both in support of it. as were many on the other side of the aisle as well. Those regulations, like I said, it passed the Senate unanimously twice. They were uncontroversial, supported by the American Bar Association. The ability to regulate this process is generally pretty well recognized. Congress also has the ability to send the amendment on to the states, and there's limitations over that process. It's also a process that has been tried and true and well known, and you heard testimony about that already today, about how that works and what the limitations are on it, and court cases that have been litigated over that process. There's quite a few that have been litigated over that process. Then there's the delegates. I'm not gonna talk much about delegates at the moment because I'm gonna go into more detail on that next week when we talk about delegate limitation statute. But there are protections over the delegates that we will get into detail on then. And then finally, there's yourselves. There's the states. You have the role first to change things about the country, about the way the Constitution works, through the amendment process, through the power that was given to you as co-equal sovereigns, the states and the federal government together. Both have equal power to amend the Constitution, and both have equal power to propose amendments that are limited to whatever subject matter you want to limit your authority to do. You also have the power to ratify anything that comes from a convention, just as you have the power to ratify anything that comes from Congress. Just as Congress couldn't propose something and then change the ratification procedure. They have two things in Congress. They have the amendment by 2/3 and then a simple majority to propose the method of ratification. The method of ratification is limited to two options, either the state legislatures or state conventions ratify. They only have those two options. They can't propose something else. The convention is limited by the exact same provision in the Constitution to only those two options and nothing else. And as you heard earlier today, nothing about the 1787 convention contradicts any of that. Indeed, this provision wasn't in place yet at that point. It's a different type of convention. So you have the ability there to yourselves ratify anything that comes out of the convention, and it needs to meet a very high bar of 3/4 of the states. Think about 2/3 of the states call for a convention limited to one subject matter. You then need 4 other states that did not call for a convention on that issue. Of the remaining 16, 1/4 of the other states that didn't even call for this issue, to say, you know what, you guys did something so great that not only does every state that called for the convention agree, so do 4 more, so do 25% of the others. And if just one house in 13 different states do not want to see it passed, they can block it, because you need 38 states in order to ratify. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fieldman. Are there any questions for Mr. Fieldman? Representative Carey.
So I'm trying to understand process. If we go through this process of the Convention of States, can the federal government then revert what has been done by the Convention of States?
In what way? Like not send it on to the states?
In the same way they are
Like
have been the only body
Sure.
that has created amendments to the Constitution.
Sure. They would have the same authority to propose an amendment as they always have. Historically, what's happened is that when they've seen Article 5 convention calls get very close, they've benched to the will of the people. We've seen that with the Bill of Rights, which Alexander Hamilton and John Jay called for the use of this process for the Bill of Rights. We've seen that with the 17th Amendment. We've seen that with other actions in Congress. But furthermore, anything that Congress proposes has the same limitations as things that are proposed by the states. It cannot be ratified unless 38 states agree to it. So if the states use this process to get an amendment to the Constitution and Congress comes along and proposes changing it back, the states can simply say no.
Other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Fieldman, for coming here to testify. This is, by the way, is being streamed. It will be on YouTube, so it's a potential nice civics lesson for those who want to understand this better. We have 3 reps, 3 legislators, and if I missed anybody in the pile, I apologize. We'll go, there's one who is for, one who is against, and one who is for. We'll go in that order. Representative Finney asked for 1 minute to speak for the measure.
Good afternoon, fellow committee members. I am Brandon Finney from Stratford 9, which is Rochester Ward 6. I come before you as a co-sponsor of the bill to present to you a few points that I think are poignant and a little more ethereal and not as technical. So I want to reiterate that the purpose of calling a convention is to affirm states' rights, which we've heard about. We as a free and individual sovereign state have the right to govern ourselves outside of federal authority. It is important to maintain our checks on power. We also have the right to tell the federal government that they're being tyrannical and they need to be reined in. And one way to do that is to amend our Constitution and to go through the process that the founders had enough foresight into to realize that in future generations, we're going to have societal, political, and technical evolution in our societies, and that we'll need to update what the Constitution covers as we progress as a society. The convention is specifically designed to be limited in specific topics. So the fear of the runaway convention, which we've heard about, it's more of a buzzword now than anything else. It really has no value or meaning. It's not possible. We need to have fundamental changes to protect our future generations from the scope and power of the federal government. And to do that is to specifically rein in the corporatism and plutocracy that's invaded our modern society, as we've allowed corporations to speak more for us than the individual. And the individual is the smallest minority in our society. Let's not kid ourselves about that. It's not groups, it's individuals. And as an individual, we have the right to be protected from that tyrannical power, state, federal, or other individuals. Our natural rights are not at risk. Again, the Bill of Rights is protected, it's not going anywhere, and cannot be changed. It is fundamental, and this is specifically talking about what the role of federal government is in our society, in our economy, in our personal lives. We want to stem political apathy and extremism in society by making the political process more inclusive, not just to other groups and individuals, but as the right of all citizens to be involved in their government. I mean, we can look around the room and see everybody that's involved here that cares about the integrity of our future and today. And today we have serious problems. We are $32 trillion in debt. That is an unfathomable amount of money that will never be paid, that could possibly collapse our entire economic system. And the reason that is happening is because we've allowed our federal government to be so involved and intertwined with private institutions that can funnel all of our congressional campaigns, that pretty much takes the policy out of it and replaces it with corporate power. We are not a corporation, we are a government of the people, and we need to change that. We need to tell our federal government that they do not have power over us, that we are a free and sovereign individual state, and we will maintain that through the convention process. I will yield any technical questions to the experts. I thank you for your time and your patience.
Thank you, Representative Finney, a co-sponsor. Speaking against the measure, Representative Timothy Horgan has asked for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me? So I'm Representative Timothy Horgan. I'm also from Stratford County, but from District 10, which is the town of Durham. And I submitted these written remarks actually a week ago at the same time as the hearing for HB 269, which was about a delegate limitation bill. So my testimony, I submitted testimony on that bill too, although I was unable to attend in person. And so about half the sponsors of the delegate limitation bill, HB 269, are also sponsors of this one. And actually, that bill is 269 is somewhat different from another bill you're going to be hearing next week, but you can worry about that one next week when that one comes. So anyway, I shared the basic concern of the HB 269 sponsors, which is Article 5 Constitutional Convention could easily turn into a runaway convention, and their preferred solution was to impose an unworkable and set of rules on our state's convention delegates, although that particular bill is like one that's passed many, many times this House. But so my preferred solutions are, one, not to have an Article 5 convention in the first place, and number two, to refuse to ratify any amendments produced by such a convention, although I suppose I would be willing to make an exception if it was a good amendment. It only takes 13 out of 50 states to block a constitutional amendment. In line 14, HCR 1, as you know, it specifies we're applying to Congress. So if this convention ever happens, it'll happen pursuant to an enabling act passed by Congress, and which means we'll have to send the number of delegates they allow us to send. We'll have to choose them the way they tell us to send it, and et cetera, et cetera. Their rights and responsibilities will be basically whatever's the convention's own rules state. So that's going to be outlined in the Enabling Act and then obviously fleshed out by the convention itself. And their responsibilities are going to be basically much the same as those enjoyed by members of Congress and at state level by us, the New Hampshire House. And actually something I didn't mention in which maybe I should have worked in my written testimony, although it's pretty long already, is that those rights and responsibilities also have their roots in English common law. So, and it's similar to other parliaments in other countries, but especially in English common law, the parliament governs itself, it sets its own rules, and it has the right, you can't be punished merely for voting the wrong way. When a measure comes to the floor, for example, just like us, we're free to press either the red or green button. It's not a crime to press the wrong button, although I do see Reverend Shirtliff here, and I was one of the Shirtliff 189, so some people decided 189 of us, Reverend Shirtliff and 180 other, voted the wrong way on a bill, and we were accused of a crime. But
Could the speaker please speak to the measure?
Well, I was speaking to the measure. Okay, so yeah, so if and when there's a convention, it's going to be operate much the same way the Congress already does. Anyway, to get back to the three specified topics, two of them are so vague it's going to guarantee a runaway convention. And I don't really know why this is not going to be a popular statement in this room, but I don't really know why it's necessary. The federal government is already under fiscal constraints, insofar as that term has any meaning at all, and the power and jurisdiction of the federal government already is limited. Maybe it should be more limited. I don't necessarily like everything the federal government does, but it's limited. The third item, it's a valid topic for a constitutional convention, I'll actually admit that, but I personally oppose it, and I think the majority of the American people reject that idea every election cycle when they democratically re-elect congresspersons and senators who've been serving for a long time, more than whatever. 12 years is kind of the standard for these term-limited amendments, but there's members of Congress who've been re-elected and serving for many, many years, and they're not any better or worse than the ones that have been serving a short time. And also, by the same token, longtime members can and do often lose their re-election bids. It happens less often in Congress due to gerrymandering than it does here. We had a number of members who lost their re-election bids, for example, here in New Hampshire. In fact, I came within 4 votes of losing my primary, but that's a subject for a whole other committee. Finally, I disagree, and this is going to be even more unpopular, with the basic rationale for convention. Our federal government is far from perfect. In fact, I'd say it's not that great at all, but it's not totally out of control. It's not out of control. It's operating, maybe just barely, but it's operating within the bounds of the United States Constitution. And it is pretty much doing what the Congress is pretty much doing what they think the people want them to do. They may be wrong in lots of cases. And I've spent 15 years of life in state government. I love all 3 branches of my state government, but the federal government is in most cases more progressive, more responsive, less oppressive than state governments. New Hampshire, we're a small state with a regressive tax system, and our state budget is going to be totally dependent on federal dollars, as we're going to find out the hard way on Valentine's Day when we get to do budget. So, and although we do have this rather wonderful and wacky state legislature that's different than those in a lot of other states, but even here, a lot of the legislation we consider is much more restrictive than anything that the Congress is considering. As for the federal debt, I agree, 31.5 trillion, it's a lot of money and it's going up. It sounds crushing, but actually our population is 330 million, and that does indeed divide out to $100,000 per person, which that's pretty scary. Although actually I think our country probably does have more than $100,000 a person worth of debt. It's not distributed very equally, but I'm sure if, say, President Putin somehow managed to buy up all our debt, we could probably break over our piggy banks.
Would the speaker,
I was speaking to, yes. So I think the rationale for the debt, we don't need an extraordinary measure like an Article 5 convention to address it. And there's another then there's another 7 trillion of that 35, which is just money one federal agency owes to another, like because their revenues and their expenditures don't always match up, just like we have. Yeah. Is that a member of the committee who's raising the point of order? Or?
Point of order.
Thank you.
Mr.
Yes,
Chair.
Mr. P.
Tony.
yes, go ahead, Representative. Point of order.
Yes, we need to talk about the bill at hand, please.
Well, obviously.
Thank you, Representative. I've asked twice if you could try to be succinct and speak directly to the measure. Representative Bernardi, would you turn that that red light up so we can hear better? And yes, go ahead and conclude, please.
I'm both opposed to the procedure, and then I'm also arguing further that it's not maybe that this is not necessarily a good solution to the problems we're facing us. So there's anyway, so all that debt. So there's like that 24 trillion of that is the money supply, and the Fed does sometimes lower the money supply, but obviously it's impossible to get the money supply down to zero. In fact, it's better to have an adequate money supply than an inadequate one. So, and the rates are pretty low. The U.S. government is actually having no trouble, and of course that's maybe one of the reasons why the debt keeps rising. They're having no trouble selling those debt instruments. The corporate sector, prefers buying those. In many
Point of
cases.
order.
Thank you.
What is your point of order?
Can the speaker conclude? We're getting way off topic.
I think I believe I'm on topic, and actually.
All right, at this time, we do need to move along. Does anyone in the committee have any questions for the speaker?
Anyway, I urge you to vote no on this, vote no on this resolution. And actually, I got to the end, though. At one point, I pointed out the USA we're actually a net creditor to the rest of the world by 14 trillion. The global economy is not great, but I don't think this Article 5 convention is going to be helpful at all. So thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions for the representative? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Yes. Next up, I would like to go to one of the co-sponsors, Representative Burnham. Is Representative Burnham in the House? Yes, she is. Speaking up to 5 minutes for the measure. Thank you, Representative.
I thought I saw it on earlier. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Claudine Burnham from Stratford County, District 2. So I recently, here's my little object lesson. I recently completed a homeschool civics class for my high school senior daughter. She is my fourth youngest out of my daughters that I've homeschooled, and I've had the privilege to teach them our wonderful Constitution and how our country operates. That was a little off cuff. I'm going to go back to what I'm going to say here because I might share a little bit something personal at the end. So this book here is kept simple for the simplified reader. And just like this book, Article 5 of the United States Constitution simply gives the opportunity for not only our elected officials for making amendments to the U.S. Constitution, but it also gives opportunity to the people to have a voice should the people decide that their elected representatives' duties are not fulfilled. How would American people know if their elected officials were in trouble or if the American government was hijacked? How could the people rein in and out-of-control spending, overreaching, nonpartisan career laddering, money-making government officials? How much of what we see in our governments today is what I just mentioned complete abuse from many of our elected officials. How can the American people help? Article 5 brings back the voice of the people. It is not easy for we the people to make a move to amending the Constitution. Indeed, it takes a lot of unification in an ununified nation. The process is arduous. The effort is great for the people. And then after all that is said and done, after all, 2/3 of the state's legislatures must be willing to call a convention. Many who are opposed to HCR 1 have nicknamed the Convention of States a runaway convention. I say we are at a precipice of a runaway government, ready to be sold to the highest bidder in the World Economic Forum. I support HCR 1. Keep it simple. Let New Hampshire's people speak. And now I share something personal. I am firstborn generation in my family. I grew up in a Polish household. Some of you may know my story. Both my grandparents were in Poland when World War II broke out. My grandmother, at the age of 15, one of 15 siblings, her and her oldest brother, were taken from their home in the middle of the night after second attempts, hiding in their home from the Germans, we would think. Yes? Wrong. That second time, when I asked my grandmother who was at the door, she said the Polish army with the German army. They were successful the second time and took her to Warsaw. She saw Hitler. She saw Stalin. She didn't know who they were. She was 15 years old. I have a 17-year-old daughter. I can't imagine what she must have thought. She was lined up in a closed-down school like cattle, physically being checked out if she was strong enough to handle a tack of bread and a small container of water, where she traveled a week on a train to a farm. And for 7 years, she was a slave labor, milking cows all day, every day, no days off. My grandfather, very similar, 9 years old. Parents weren't able to take care of him. Father had died. He's had to live in a barn at a local farm to shovel manure all day so he can get something to eat by the end of the day. And by the time he was 12, he enlisted in the Polish army. That's where his story ends for me, because he cannot share anymore. We are down the slippery slope already. If we don't speak, then who will? Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Okay, next I'm looking for Representative Potenza. Is he, or she, I'm sorry, she is in the House, she's here from Rochester. It asked for 2 minutes. And welcome, Representative Potenza. Yes, I do. And I would point out that we have a tradition in the House where we do try to refrain from signals or applause or that type of thing. I just needed to pass that on. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you very much. My name's Representative Potenza. I'm Kelly Potenza. I'm from Stratford District 19 in Rochester. I fully support, as I'm a co-sponsor of the bill, HCR 1. I was going to say a lot of things today, and I changed my tune because we had, of course, Michael Ferris here, which was amazing, and he can answer all of these constitutional questions. And really, some of it is just, it's a lot of fear. And why are we living in this place where we're basing everything on fear, and fear controls? So Article 5 was made for such a time as this. The Founding Fathers just didn't give us, hey, just focus on these articles.
They knew that at some point in time that we would reach where we are today. We really no longer have a government that is about we the people. There's not really a runaway convention. We don't have to worry about that. That's been disproven, like I said, by multiple scholars. We actually have a runaway government. So taxation without representation, everything that's going on right now, trillions of dollars in spending, that's not what I voted for. You know, we are about who decides, right? Not what is decided. That's what freedom is all about. So securing freedom to be self-governing, to be able to make decisions that align with what we believe and what you believe, without someone trying to mandate or impose beliefs or decisions on you, that's how our founding fathers decided this. This is why they had this option. Convention of States is really where I've gotten so much of my information. I feel very blessed to have wonderful people that have educated me, and I'm not a scholar on this at all. But this Article 5, it's this kind of unifying, nonpartisan, freedom-loving movement for liberty that is really centrally aligned with what, like I said, our founding fathers fought so hard to give us. Article 5 of the Constitution was given us so we can ensure that we're able to continue to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. And so the only question really left to ask all of you is, are you brave enough to help us fight for the freedom to keep it? Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Is there any, and it looks like we're not going to be taking questions here at this time. Are there any other legislators here, sitting legislators, that we've missed? And not seeing any, I'd like to ask the Honorable Jim Rubens, a former multi-term state senator here in Concord from Etna. Welcome back, Senator Rubens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for taking the time to hear this bill. So I'm going to focus on, first of all, a little background. I've been involved in the what's I'm calling the amending movement. I'm for all of the above. And so I'm background, former District 5 state senator, represented Hanover, Lebanon, New London area. Former chair of the New Hampshire GOP Platform Committee, so I've dig into ideas. I was a GOP primary candidate for the U.S. Senate in 2014, 2016. I've experienced the election process from various levels. I'm a member of an informal group, a steering group that works together with all the amending organizations that is trying to keep in touch with one another, trying to mobilize together. I'm a board member for American Promise, AmericanPromise.net, which is the nation's leading group focused on a congressionally drafted amendment to allow Congress and the states to limit campaign money. And I'm a volunteer backer of the Wolfpack state-led Article 5 process, also focused on seeking limits to allowable limits to campaign money. So I've been very, very involved in this movement at many levels for about 10 years. So I'm just going to speak to two things. One, I'm going to speak to all members of the committee about the runaway process and protections against that, the alleged, asserted, hypothesized runaway convention, to put you at ease on that. And secondly, I'm going to speak just to maybe the Democrats on the committee here on another topic. And I won't repeat protections against runaway, except there are basically 9 of them. 9 levels of protection against a runaway convention that would digress from the application that you see here in HCR 1. The document you see is very brief. It describes what delegates can do, what they can talk about, what they can propose at the convention. So the hypothesized runaway convention is a process where somehow we get something different than what is described in the bill you see right here in HCR 1. So protection number 1, you've probably already heard about this, the U.S. Department of Justice opinion of 1979, which clearly opines that a convention can limit itself to the subjects named, as you see here in HCR 1. That's protection 1. Protection 2 is a bit of history. There have been 41 multi-state conventions to date, 11 before. 1787 and 30 afterward, and not a single one of the 41 multi-state conventions that we've experienced in our United States of America and before we were the United States has ever digressed from the subject matter limitations in the application. So there's a very, very strong history of conventions, multi-state conventions, sticking to the task assigned to them. Next, this is the third level of protection. Congress is barred constitutionally from calling a convention outside of the limits specified in HCR 1. How would that bar happen? It would undoubtedly almost instantaneously be litigated. We're a litigation-happy society, so should there be a convention derived from HCR 1 here, and someone assert that the subject matter might include some environmental matter, global warming or anything else, there would be litigation against that. And given the conservative nature of the Supreme Court, the litigation would likely prevail, so Congress would be barred from calling the convention. So that's protection number 3. Protection number 4 is the delegates to the convention under law act in a principal-agent relationship. So you folks are the principal, you in the New Hampshire legislature here, you have a live application now in HCR 40 from 2012 relative to budget balancing and debt limit. So should you appoint delegates associated with HCR 40, those delegates are your agents. You folks sitting in the room, and you have a power over them. So should they digress from the charge you've given them in HCR 1, or in this case HCR 40, they are breaching the implied contract from you. You already have that power. 15 states have gone a bit beyond that, and they've passed a delegate limitation law. 15 states have done this. You folks have heard one last Friday. You heard a delegate limitation law that takes a power you already have, that principal agent power you already have controlling the delegates, forcing them to stick to the subject matter limitations in your resolution, in the application. So this would simply, this bill would simply speed the process and formalize it. So that's protection number 4. Protection number 5 is a law you might pass. Protection number 6, you folks appoint, likely, you will be the people who will appoint the delegates to the amendment convention. And this is where it gets a little emotional. I trust you folks to appoint delegates, number 1, that will stick to the task that you've assigned to them. You folks will have written and passed the legislation in HCR 1 describing the task of the delegates. I'm confident you folks will appoint delegates who will stick to that task. Not only that, delegates who will work very hard to find consensus around language reflecting the task, the charge you give them. I have confidence in you, and I have far more confidence in you than I do in members of Congress, because I can walk up and I can talk with you folks. I can't do that in Congress. I got to pay now somewhere in the, I'm getting a little, to get a walk and talk in the U.S. Senate is about a $5,000 to $20,000 campaign contributions. I don't have to do that to talk with you folks, so I trust you folks. Protection number 7, should delegates propose an amendment outside the charge you've given them, for example, here in HCR 1, Congress would be forbidden by the Constitution from sending that proposal, that proposed amendment, back to the states for potential ratification, because it digresses from the charge originally given to the delegates and to the amendment convention. And again, there would be litigation should Congress attempt to send back to the states for potential ratification a proposed amendment outside the charge. Protection number 8, I'll skip beyond that one. And protection number 9, which is really the strongest one of all, and this has been mentioned and it can be stated very briefly. And this is the one because I've been on the phone for about a month talking with people about this Article 5 process. And I've heard the concerns about it. They're almost entirely concerns about the Runaway Convention. This is your strongest protection of all. Let's say all those other 8 levels of protection fail, and a rogue amendment somehow gets back to the states for ratification. It requires 38 states to ratify it. As you heard, it takes only 13 of 99 legislative bodies in this country to kill any amendment that is not, number one, well thought out, understandable by the people, reflects the will of the people, and is supported broadly across the political spectrum. Anything coming out of the convention to propose amendments that does not fulfill those criteria is dead on arrival. 13 legislative bodies out of 99 can kill it. That's the ultimate protection. So that's my testimony to all of you. Now, in speaking to just maybe the Democrats on the committee here and the Democrats in this body here, hopefully this will come back to the floor for debate. If you read the three-part application here, and I'm speaking for myself on this, just for myself, this is my personal opinion. If you look at the second feature, the second leg of this three-part application, limiting the power of the federal government. If you look at our campaign money system we have right now, and again, this is my personal view, we have a campaign money system that has become very, very federalized due to the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision of 2010. That decision stripped from you folks here in the state, in all the states, the power to regulate campaign money, except money direct to candidates. That power was completely stripped from you by an act of the federal government, the federal Supreme Court, without a factual basis, by the way, power stripped from you completely and from Congress. So this is a matter of the federal court removing in 2010 a power from you to stop things like Chinese money coming into elections for members of Congress here in the state. And again, remember, I ran for the US Senate in 2014, 2016. I've experienced some of this stuff. It stripped from you the power here in the state to say, we want our legislators, we want our candidates of whatever party to reflect our viewpoints, our unique value system, our unique issue priorities that reflect here in the state of New Hampshire. The money system we have right now, imposed upon you here in New Hampshire by the federal government through the Supreme Court, strips the power that you have to say, we want our candidates to reflect our issues priorities. We want our candidates to reflect our values in our state, as opposed to a super PAC from California or run by Senator Schumer or Senator McConnell. This is the way the money system right now, highly federalized, suppressing local candidates, suppressing local viewpoints. So here's where this COS, this three-part resolution comes in, limiting the power of the federal government. And again, I'm a volunteer with Wolfpack, okay? Wolfpack has 3 states now with live applications on the way to 34. That's a long way from 3. This application is at 19 states on its way to 34. This application, this is why Democrats ought to get behind it. Right now, it's mostly red states that have adopted this resolution in their states. Purple states and blue states ought to be doing this, because this is, in my view, this is a direct pathway to giving states once again the power to take Chinese money out of your elections, to take super PAC money from California or wherever else you don't like out of your elections, so that we in New Hampshire can control our selection of members of Congress once again. So, and I believe that any such a delegate proposing language restoring to states this power would be germane to this language in this HCR1. And so I'll stop there, and happy to answer any questions. And thank you, members of the committee, for your time. I hope this comes out of your committee with a unanimous recommendation of ought to pass. Unanimous.
Well, thank you, Senator. Representative Carey.
Former Senator Rubens, you're going to make the administrative assistant mad at me if I have a list of 9 items and I'm missing number 8. So what is number 8, please?
Well, they're on this. Did you get the salmon
Well,
sheet
if
here?
you could, just for the record, be easier than me digging out paperwork.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I put my glasses on. Forgive me. I'm trying not to repeat stuff. So. This is number 8. This is Congress being constitutionally barred from submitting back to the states, and I mentioned this briefly. Congress being constitutionally barred from submitting back to the states again for potential ratification a proposed amendment that may come out of the convention but that does not adhere to the subject matter limitations, in this case in HCR 1. So there would be litigation about that. I'm confident that this whole process would be monitored in real time by legal eyes across the country, and that such filings for runaway proposed amendments would be objected to by litigation very promptly. Yeah.
Other questions for Senator Rubens? Representative Massimilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for taking my question.
Most welcome.
Do you believe, as many people do, that if there was the chance, like say we got to the 33 state application, that Congress might then be forced to take up the subject that the convention was going to originally take up?
Absolutely. Thank you. I didn't get to that. My written testimony covers this, but about half of the 27 present amendments to the U.S. Constitution probably happened because of this Article 5 state-led process. The Congress feels the heat, sees the light. We already heard about the Bill of Rights having originated as a result of pressure from the states, the 17th Amendment related to direct election of U.S. senators. So this process here, and again, this applies to all members of this committee, if you have some degree of lack of confidence in this process has been successful in getting Congress to get up off its duff and deal with the issues. Again, the issues being covered here are broadly supported by the American public. Congress thus far will not act. Any extent to which we increase the number of states, in this case from 19 up toward 30, 34, is going to increase pressure on Congress to get its act in gear and do what the American people want.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions for Senator Rubens?
Thank you.
Not seeing any. Thank you, Senator. And okay, a couple things. Again, as I mentioned before, we have a tradition here where we try to avoid signaling or applause, so I do need to pass that on a second time. The Honorable Fenton Grown, is he here? There he is. Yes, another Rochester, very well represented today. Welcome back, Honorable Fenton Grown.
Thank you. I will not go into the details of how this works because you've heard a whole lot about that. I do believe it's a very safe process. I was the sponsor of a Article 5 resolution when I was in the Senate in 2011. It passed in 2012, and I might say it passed 19-5 in the Senate, and with, I believe, a 60 or 61% majority in the House at that point. So I won't go into that. What I want to talk about is why is it needed. So first of all, I believe it's a safe process. I believe we should do it. I believe that the danger of not doing it is far greater than the danger of a runaway convention. So I want to talk about what the purpose of this is. So the first purpose that's limited here is to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Now, looking at the committee here, I see a few of you that were here in 1980, as I was, not here in this room, but here on this earth, in 1980. You wonder what the federal debt was in 1980. It was $918 billion in 1980. And I thought that was awful, $918 billion. In 2003, excuse me, in 1998, 25 years ago, it was 3.8 trillion. In 2003, 5 years later, it was 6.8 trillion. In 2012, when we passed the resolution in the Senate and then the House, it was 16 trillion, and today it is 31.5 trillion. So just to put this in perspective, I won't give percentages because they're too big to give. That is a 34.3 time increase since 1980 in our federal debt. It is an 8.3 multiplier increase since 1998, 4.6 since 2003, doubled since 2012. Now, let's talk a little bit about the debt. For years, as you know, we had rock bottom interest rates. The federal debt was being serviced at under 2%. Today, Treasury bonds are being sold for over 4%. If you take that 2% difference in interest, it's $630 billion a year, 0.6 trillion a year increase in service of the federal debt. That's without the federal debt growing. What's that going to do to inflation going on? What's that going to do to budget going on? Now, what brings this about? So that comes to the second part of it, the reining in the power of the federal government. I'm a contractor, general contractor. For 18 years, we built homes and some commercial. Today, we're strictly a commercial contractor. I've been a member for many years of the National Association of Home Builders. Their statistics I saw in December, they came out and they said that today, for the price of a new home, and we all know we want to have affordable housing, for the price of a new home, 41.5% of the cost of a new home is due to regulations. Okay? Now, we know some of those are needed, and I won't argue that, but some of them are way overboard. The bigger problem with it is that many, if not most of those regulations are not created by the federal government or even by the state. They're created by either private or federal or state bureaucracies. Yes, I know there's an approval process, but the approval process generally does not deal with the specifics, as is when we approve a new building code here in New Hampshire. So we need, and especially in the federal government level, we need that brought back more to the power of limiting that power of anybody but the legislature making that, making those regulations. I'm very familiar with something that's called WOTUS, W-O-T-U-S. And if you're not in construction or issues regarding land use, you're probably not familiar with that. That's called Waters of the United States. Now, Waters of the United States, when the bill was passed, I believe it was in the 70s, was navigable waters and defined as something you can run a boat on. Initially, that was rivers such as the Mississippi and Missouri that were navigable for commerce. Eventually, it was added that it was navigable by boats in general. In, I believe it was 2014 or 15, an executive order came out and then was followed up by rules that expanded WOTUS, the waters of the United States, to be anything that fed a navigable water. And as a result, a man-made ditch that was created by a farmer and had water run through it periodically and might have some wetland grasses and stuff in it, became waters of the United States and became subject to that regulation. It added trillions of dollars to development costs. Much of that stays in place today. That was not approved by Congress. That was not put in by Congress. We need an ability to rein this in. We need an ability for Congress to challenge such rules and be more effective in it. That could be part of this type of a process. We know what's happened with executive orders. Under both Democrats and Republicans, executive orders have taken on the level of law, and I don't believe they're being challenged properly by the courts or by Congress. Do we need this? We need it desperately, and we need it now. Thank you. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Are there questions for former Senator Goen? Seeing none, thank you for coming here from Rochester.
Thank you.
Okay, the Honorable Kurt Welper, I saw in the House earlier. Is he still here? Yes, he is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'll be brief. I support this for three reasons. One reason is I think this is something that we absolutely need to help unify our country. The political process we have and the operation in Washington has put us in a place where we haven't had a budget in years. It seems like they can't pass a bill to recognize the colors of the United States flag, and we're helpless. You've heard a lot about the debt and all of that. That's absolutely true. I 100% concur. It needs to get fixed, but it isn't getting fixed. We're going to be putting another couple million on here, whatever, next week, next month, a trillion, I meant. It's ridiculous. So we have to fix it. And the founders gave us a way. This is the way. The lawsuit that's out there, Attorney General to be the prime sponsor, is a necessary step in that because, well, maybe not, because Congress is failing to do its job. It doesn't tally requests, and it doesn't thereby know or recognize when a valid Article 5 request has been made. And if it does, they just must be with those other classified documents that went somewhere else. So I just see this as something we have to do. It can't get done any other way in my view, and this has not been an unknown problem for the past 40 or 50 years. It's been discussed on a regular basis. It's time to get moving, and the way to do it, unfortunately, is to force Congress to do its job. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions for the Honorable Kurt Walper? Not seeing any. The Honorable Erica Victoria Eastman. Is she from Nashua, or is she here still? I'm not seeing her. Okay, moving along, I want to make a quick comment or two here. I will be here as long as it takes. I very much enjoy being here. That's why I wanted to be here. I sponsored a civics bill. It's now law. Not all of the members will be able to stay for the whole duration. I will be here. Most of us will be here. So as we move along here, I still have a pretty good stack of pink cards. As we go through these, I don't want to limit anybody's testimony. If we can avoid that, you took the time to travel here, and I want to hear, and others want to hear what you have to say. So we will just simply ask if the salient main points that you want to make have already been stated, then you don't need to necessarily elaborate on what has been said. I would say that. And if anybody wants to wave off, you certainly can. And finally, I will point out that this is streaming live. It will be on YouTube. I don't know if Senator Rubins is still here, but his eighth point, whoever's watching or going to watch on YouTube would have wanted to know that eighth point. Representative Carey, I'm glad you asked that. So we will move right along. I see some folks have asked for 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, and we want to honor your request and your time. But again, if some of the points have been made, feel free to not repeat them. So let's now go to Al Brandano, who I've seen before, and there he is.
Thank you very much, Chairman Moffitt and committee. My name is Al Brandano. I am the State Director for the Convention of States. And may I begin in this beautiful hall, and I always am overwhelmed when I look around me of the people who have come before us and what they've had to do for the benefit of all of us. But I want to start with the words of Alexander Hamilton in 1788, Federalist 51. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external or internal controls on government would be necessary. In that spirit, I rise today in support of HCR 1, the resolution of the Convention of States to simply propose amendments to this U.S. Constitution and not change it. You may ask me why. I ask you, why not? 1, federal term limits. Why not? Over 80% of the U.S. population is in support of it. It's interesting, if you look at Congress and the Senate, they have a 19% approval rating, yet they're elected 95% of the time. If you were a lobbyist, who would you be investing in? Number 2, fiscal responsibility. Why not? It's supported by 70% of the U.S. voters. In fact, today when you left your house, your wife or husband probably asked you before you left if we were going to make the budget this week or we had to cut back on something. Well, guess what? The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office just this week agrees with you. They told us that Social Security could go bust as early as 2033 and Medicare trust fund insolvency by 2027. Number 3, return to states' rights. Why not? 1776, Colonel Mason, the father of Article 5, and visionary of liberty, guided by the wisdom of Federalist 51, got unanimous consent of no greater body of men of wisdom ever assembled in history at the time of the Constitution. Imagine that. At that time, 90% of the power of the government would be governed by the states. Today, it's nearly reversed. 90% is federal, and 10% is the states. Yet, sadly, for 7 years, I've come before your committee. And this committee has prevented debate to the full floor of the House. And it's been locked away maybe for politics or even shamefully misguided fear. During this time that we've been unable to address this, the federal government has run away to $31 trillion. I want to indicate and show you what 31 trillion is. We talk about it, but we don't know. It's 18 round trips from the earth to the sun and back, $1 laid end to end. Think about that for a minute. That's what it is. According to Janet Yellen today, the Federal Reserve has taken an extraordinary effort to not default. And this is what I've taken in my bag for the last 7 years. These little shoes. And they mean something to me. Because what they mean to me is we're putting our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren in servitude. These little shoes, when we talk about voting on these things, we don't think about this. This is the future. And we're putting them in servitude. And we can't do that. And we must act. For our national security is also at great risk. Members of this committee, it is my sworn duty and sworn oath to exercise and protect the Constitution as you do, not parts of it, but all of it. Democrat, independent, Republican, libertarian, to come together in a peaceful way to form a more perfect union. I have great faith in you to do the justice of the people and the state of New Hampshire. You will do well in the signers and following the signers, their wisdom, their courage, and the visionary of Colonel Mason, who inspired the principles of Article 5. Please, I urge you, vote to pass HCR 1 out of your committee, for it is only right and just that the whole body politic must have the ability to speak for the people of New Hampshire on this constitutional matter. So help us God. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brandano. Okay, it looks like we're moving along now. Nathaniel Lavecchio and Brody Lavecchio, are they still here? Would you mind coming up to the microphone in tandem. Looks like you're together. You're both from Nottingham, yes?
Yes, sir.
Are you both speaking?
We can, or I can just speak. It doesn't matter.
I have both your names. How about if you both stand up there, and you've asked for only a minute apiece, so welcome.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the committee. My name is Nathaniel Lavecchio, and I'm here to speak on behalf of calling a convention of the states. I'm asking that you please approve HCR 1, the reason being the careless spending of our country's resources by Congress. I'm 17 years old, therefore I cannot vote yet, and I cannot vote on what my taxes are being used for. This means my generation and the future generations after my time are going to be held responsible for the debt of which we couldn't even vote on. Not only that, but with Congress having no term limits set in place, our voices will likely never be understood by the current Congress. With that, I would lastly like to say, Vincent Omnia Veritas, and thank you all for your time.
Hello, my name is Brody, and I'll be speaking as well as on behalf of the Convention of States. I'm asking you to vote yes, for the reason that me and my brother, as well as all of our generation, will be the future of America, and I feel, and I feel like we are not being represented as the younger, new generation, and I also feel like even though I cannot work or vote, that my future tax dollars are being spent carelessly without any minor thought on where they're going to. With that being said, thank you all for your time, and have a good afternoon.
You take any questions if there are any?
We can accept any questions if you like.
Does anyone have any questions for Nathaniel or Brody? Seeing none, thank you both for taking the time to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening to us.
The former representative from Nashua, is that? Yes, if you come up and for our clerk, if you state your name.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Erica Victoria Eastman, and in a past lifetime served here in this august chamber very proudly, and it's a thrill to be back. Before my former committee, as it happens. I'm just here to speak briefly about change and imperative. Life is change, we've all heard that adage. Sometimes big changes occur in everyone's life and in the course of the lifetime of a nation that have tremendous imperatives. Other times it's little stuff. But when those imperatives present themselves, we find ourselves faced with unknown factors and unknown strategies or unclear strategies in order to confront them, overcome them, and move on, and hopefully move on to a better place. I know a little bit about change, quite evidently, and this nation certainly does too. The mechanism of Article 5 is simply a roadmap. Has it ever been done? Well, attempts have been made many, many, many times, but the actual manifestation of a convention of states is an unprecedented event here in this country. Does that mean it's not viable? Of course not. Lots of people in the course of their lives confront change for which they have no roadmap. All they have is conviction and imperative. And they handle it. They innovate if they have to. They improvise. In this particular instance in the life of our nation, we don't have to do that. We have a roadmap. We have precedent. We have a mechanism in place. I've confronted immense change in my life and didn't have one of those, didn't have any of that. So what does it take? It takes a recognition of the degree of imperative. The why. Why fix this? Well, if the why is big enough, the what will present itself as you go. Luckily, in this case, we have a what. But now we also have a why. Bear that in mind, members of the committee, please, as you move forward to vote on this matter. The why is valid. The what is already delineated in our founding documents. The precedent for that what? It exists throughout the course of history in this nation. Remain focused on the why. Change is hard, change is good, and it's inevitable. Thank you for your time.
Would you take any questions, if there are any? Representative Carey.
Just a point of clarification, are you rising in support of this bill, neutral on this bill, or against this bill?
I am in support
Thank you.
of this resolution, representing the people of Nashua.
Thank you. Okay, speaking in opposition to the bill, I have here next up Ross Payne from Merrimack. Is Ross here? Ross, Payne. And you are not Ross Payne, or you are Ross Payne. Okay, well, welcome.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm from Merrimack. I oppose HCR 1. It attacks what makes America the greatest nation in all history. It's not our land and natural resources or our people who have fled from tyranny. It's the Constitution that has kept us free for 2.5 centuries. It does not need to be fixed. It just needs to be obeyed. Okay, because we the people have made poor choices at the ballot box, the source of our runaway federal government is the image that looks back at us from the mirror. There are other ways to limit federal power, and the state government has a checks and balance, and that's state nullification. Article 5 conventions are dangerous, for documented historical precedents reveal that James Madison observation that he trembles for the results of a second convention is wisdom that is critical to passing judgment on Article 5 conventions. As early as 1776, Madison saw the dangers that loom in our future if another Article 5 convention becomes reality. Where the founders invoked the premise in the Declaration of Independence that the people have a self-evident right to alter or abolish their government and set up a new government to throw off British monarchy. For the second time, Madison invoked this self-evident right to throw off tyranny in 1787 to replace the Articles of Confederation. The fact that both George Soros and the Koch brothers and many socialist billionaires fund this movement doesn't this mean they have bought the opinions of COS and Wolfpack. Oh, where am I at here? Excuse me. they're not what they used to be. Their con job is it can't be a runaway convention. But because any Article 5 convention is a representation of the sovereign will of the people, the threat is we will duplicate what happened in 1787. Unfortunately, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay will not be there to guard our liberty. Don't you think it's time that Mark Meckler of COS accepts the John Birch Society's expert on the subject, Robert Brown, challenge, a $10,000 challenge that was given, I believe, in Montana several years ago, to debate Robert Brown on this issue. I'd like to see him come to New Hampshire and debate Robert Brown. I believe that's, and I have a picture of, I will give the committee a picture, but Wolfpack in 2016. Their lobbyist, Ryan Clayton, standing in the front hall, obviously. Wolfpack lobbyist, Ryan Clayton, in Concord in 2016. There's a bunch of ladies that don't want Convention of States or Wolfpack's convention calls. And they got signs. But Mr. Clayton is standing out in front of them, and they don't know it, but he has a sign language for them. A vulgar sign language right here in his stomach. So I don't think that's too much class. Maybe he learned it in law school, I don't know. But that's my presentation, and I'd like to give the committee a copy of my.
Thank you, Mr. May. Yes, if you could get that up here so we can get it to our clerk for our record. And thank you for coming up here from Merrimack.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
John Terrio asked for 2 minutes to speak for the bill. Is John? There he is. From Keene, representing himself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I stood before this committee 6 years ago to speak in favor of a similar resolution, the Convention of States resolution at the time. It was HCR 4, and the main sponsor was the Honorable Frank Edelblut. Some of you may know him as our Education Commissioner. It passed this committee unanimously, OTP. It got held up administratively, and on the floor of the House in one of those marathon sessions before the crossover, it got tabled because a small number of representatives threatened to filibuster at 7 p.m. at night, and everybody wanted to go home and have dinner and see their family. I don't want that to happen again. But ask yourself this, in the 6 years since this committee said this should pass, OTP, unanimously, has the debt been reduced? No. Has the federal government overreached? Less. No. Is the influence of lobbyists and dark money on incumbent politicians less? No. Everything has gone in the wrong direction. And you have the power to start the wheel turning that gives the American people the opportunity to right this ship. The Constitution gives state legislatures the co-equal responsibility with Congress to propose amendments, not to do anything else other than to propose them. Congress can do it directly. You can do it through a convention of states. Please do your duty and forward HCR 1 with unanimous agreement that it ought to pass the House. And please get it on the calendar early so we don't get jammed up in the crossover period. Thank you.
Thank you. Take any questions? Are there any questions? So Kerry.
So why do you think this has repeatedly failed here in New Hampshire?
As I said, we've got a small group of folks who oppose a convention on what I would call emotional terms. They're convinced that it would run away. They're convinced that it would be a danger to the Constitution, especially to the Second Amendment, both of which are bunk, but they're convinced, and no amount of facts, no amount of history, as Dr. Ferris talked about, will sway them. And that's why it has to, if it needs to go to a full debate on the House so that all the House can talk to this minority, make up their own minds, and have a reasonable time to debate and vote on it, I think that's the best thing that can happen.
Other questions? Seeing none, I thank you again for taking time to be here and for your testimony. Is Christine Lavecchio here? It's a third Lavecchio, with the other, probably with the two boys. She'd asked for 1 minute. I think that we're good with her. Charles Kraus. Is Charles here? Charles is here from Peterborough, representing himself, speaking for the bill. He asked for a few minutes or a few moments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. I'm happy to be here. I think most of what I was going to say has been said, but if you'll just bear with me for a moment or two. The debt burden was mentioned several times today. It's a colossal burden. I was born in Washington, D.C. 77 years ago. And I remember in the year 2000, I think when Clinton was president and the Congress was doing its job, we actually had a couple of surpluses. And also from 1789 to 1930, that's like 140 years. We only had about 40 deficit years, and that included the Civil War and a couple of other terrible things. So it's really gotten, it's unbelievable. I don't know where the gentleman was speaking of before that thought things were getting better. Unbelievably better and worse. And many of the risks and uncertainties have been addressed nicely to have a convention. And also, if you don't have a convention, where is this country going to go? It's unbelievable to me. And I grew up, my mother was born in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. I spent almost all my life in New Hampshire, and it's a wonderful state. It's a well-run state. It's fiscally conservative, and people are respected, and the people are nice, and we don't have the crime and the bad water and the bad air and everything else. But at the federal level, the old saying, all power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's been proven in spades in the last number of years. And we've got a Congress which writes vague legislation so that an unelected bureaucracy can do all kinds of horrible things that really stymie. My sister spent 17 years building a community theater in Jaffrey, New Hampshire. It took her 17 years to pass all the regulations and the zoning and this and that and bringing power in. And now it's a wonderful community structure right now with all kinds of artistic events from the grade schools and elementary schools and colleges in the area and civic groups, all kinds of things. So, but that shows you I mean, today, what do we need? We don't have a shortage of natural gas. We need pipelines. We can't build a pipeline. The Great Navigable Rivers Act was passed like in the 1970s. It was supposed to be for bodies of water that could transport large ships carrying goods and merchandise. And now, apparently, if you've got a spring vernal pool in your backyard, they can oversee that. It's just very unfortunate, and it proves the old adage: the road to hell is paved with good intentions. People mean well, but power is just something that is really, and that's what the founders worried about. They had the three branches of the federal government. They had the shared federal-state federalism to diffuse power. Now we have presidents that have executive orders, Congress which doesn't do its job. United States senators and representatives, until recently, all they could do was sit in the very end and say yes or no. They couldn't offer amendments. They couldn't have debates. The committees were a shambles. This is the United States Congress. It's just unbelievable. So I think the dangers are much greater if we do nothing. And this is going to be a wonderful thing. It can be a wonderful thing. And we have wonderful people today talking about it. So I certainly would hope everybody here can get on board and do as the representative here said, to have unanimous passage to the main body of the House. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for coming all the way from Peterborough. Jerome Gates. Is Jerome still? Jerome is here. From Moultonborough, all the way from Moultonborough. Speaking 3 minutes for the bill, for the measure.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, my name is Jerome Gates. I'm from Moultonborough in Carroll County. Understandably, when discussing Article 5 of the Constitution and the Convention of States, most people focus on the many serious problems that exist with our federal government today, out-of-control spending, the usurpation of power, and the lack of transparency. But I'd like to spend the brief amount of time that I have with you today mentioning the process of Convention of States, which I think is equally important. And I'm not talking about the 34 states that are needed to hold the Convention of States. I think there's more to it than that formidable requirement. If you mention any one of the topics under HCR 1, most people have pretty strong opinions about them. But until now, there hasn't been a forum for the average citizen to join in the debate. And yet these issues are vitally important to the future of our country. Convention of States will provide us with the forum needed to discuss and debate these important topics. Some of the proposals might actually be approved, but any proposal that's approved must be sent back to all of the states for consideration. And then we need 38 state legislatures to approve it. You know better than most how hard it is to get anything approved in a state legislature, let alone 38 of them. So, anyone concerned about a runaway convention should take comfort in the fact that there will be no amendment to the Constitution unless 38 state legislatures approve it. The important thing, and this is my main point today, is that there be a debate. If you have a debate, people will be satisfied that we were at least able to have the discussion in a format that was not being controlled by federal government employees, many of whom are more concerned with maintaining their power even at the expense of our future. So I urge you to allow us to have the debate by approving HCR 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Would you take any questions? If there are any questions for Mr. Gates.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Joe Torelli. Is Joe still here? Joe is here. Welcome, Joe, from Hampton, speaking up to 5 minutes for the bill.
I'll do my best, and I promise not to read from this book. My name is Joe Torelli. I live in Hampton. I am a constitutional, I define myself as a constitutional libertarian because I am so often frustrated and repulsed by the Democrat Party and the Republican Party and their activities and what they do in our nation's capital. And what I want to expose and elevate is something that Representative Potenza mentioned earlier, as did State Senator Rubens, This is totally nonpartisan. Everything about this is nonpartisan. When John Langdon had to postpone and adjourn the ratification convention in February of 1788 in Exeter, it was because not enough people knew why we needed a federal constitution. And one guy in Amherst, Joshua Atherton, said, hey, I've got these 12 amendments I'd like to add to this. 12 amendments. Well, later, those 12 amendments, 10 of them became our Bill of Rights. Okay? So Langdon adjourned the meeting in February of 1788 and met up the street here in the Old Town Meeting Hall, which sits on the property that borders State Street and Church Street. Does that mean there's an intersection of church and state? Yes. So in February, they spent 9 days debating 3 pages of the Constitution. 9 days debating 3 pages of the Constitution. And Atherton helped to postpone it because there was so much to debate and discuss. And so Langdon and John Sullivan said, oh, well, we need to effectively, using our terms today, market why we need a federal constitution. Let's hold off 4 months and meet in Concord, which they did. And on June 21st, the solstice in 1788, 1 p.m., not only did that group of people ratify the Constitution, but New Hampshire was the 9th state to do that, which enacted the Constitution just up the road here. The building burned down. It's where Binney Media is, far right corner. And when you think about the history of the ancestors of the state legislators that are seated today, they did that. I say that the state legislators are compelled as their duty to pass this resolution. You are the check and balance among 33 other states to be able to get the process moving so that we can get this to happen. So one of the things that we have, and getting back to the nonpartisan nature, is that Democrats and Republicans in each state, whether it's Bismarck, whether it's Cheyenne, whether it's Salem, whether it's Tallahassee, they should want to bring back these funds that are being sent to Washington to their state capitals so that the one-size-fits-all is kind of like, oh, gee, maybe it's better in the state of Washington to do this than it is in Missouri. And so we need to deconstruct the K Street lobbyist influence in Washington by addressing the 3 topics that are in this resolution so that we can begin to change this and bring it back. And again, I feel personally, it is the duty of the state representatives and the state senators in each of the states to understand that you are the people that George Mason and James Madison actually figured was better than what Alexander Hamilton wanted to do with a music track underneath, to only have Congress do it. Why would Congress be the only ones to change the Constitution? It had to go back to the states because every state was different. There were only 13 at the time. Now we have 50. So I'm going to finish 4:58. I'm done. Happy to answer questions.
Are there any questions? Representative Carey.
You cited a book, that one that's about 4 inches thick. Would you give me the title of that book,
Yes,
please?
I will, and even better than that, we are, there's a group of us that are working on the author condensed this book to 6-page executive summary. And I have requested of the author the permission to reprint the 6-page executive summary. So I can get you these, and I can get them for both parties, because this attacks the attacks and provides documented evidence of what the different challenges were and why. This alone is 15 minutes reading time, and it's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. So I offer this and more of them, and we would love to get them in the hands of each of the representatives so that they can read it, but we also want to have a discussion and to talk about it.
Title of the book?
Sorry? Oh, the book is Far From Unworkable. And I would love to have the ability to put 2 of these in the state library across the street so that you all can check it out and go to page 736. There's 820 in here. I have not read this, but I have read enough of it to know that the evidence is all in here. This is fantastic. I was going to offer that as a stand for the microphone. Yes, Representative Finney, I think you have a question? The name of the book. Okay, I'll hold it up for the camera. Camera's that way? Okay, Far From Unworkable. And it's Tim Dake, and he's a professor from Wisconsin. And it works.
Would you believe that my daughters attended school on the site of the Walker School, which was on the site of the previous meeting house at the church state in Boonton?
How about in Boonton? So this is the book that the state legislature commissioned in 1888 on the 100th anniversary of it. This is the actual 1888 book that describes Langdon sending Walker to take 5 of the detractors out, got them drunk so that they couldn't make the vote, stuff like that. But you know what? Dirty tricks are dirty tricks, so whatever. But I'm happy to discuss it with anybody and go over this and this if anybody's interested. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the history lesson in Representative Carey. So in a sense, our country was born, make a case, our country was born at that spot here in Concord in 1788, as we know it. Matthew Rhodes, did I say that correctly, Rhodes? Matthew? Yes, you have 20 copies for us, and we'll get those to the reps who had to leave early. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to me today and for being here and serving the people of New Hampshire. So I'll remember what FDR said, is to be sincere, be brief, and be seated. And it's interesting here what's going on today. And I'm listening to the various testimonies concerning HRC 1, and I wonder how we arrived as a nation at this point where we would see a PAC so massive as the Convention of States project pouring such a vast amount of resources and money into an effort that has really no blueprint, despite what everything that's being said here today, while claiming the whole time that it does. The Herculean effort to cajole, barter, influence legislators across the country surely could have been spent on other efforts that would have proven more immediately useful and beneficial to the American people. Instead, we are debating under this fantastical notion that somehow term limits is the magical answer to fixing a government that is out of control, a government that acts immorally, which ignores the constraints the Constitution already puts on it, on their enumerated powers, which are clearly stated in Article 1, Section 8. So term limits will not take corrupt people out of the circle of influence of government, and in fact, makes a newer and newer freshman class of naive legislators vulnerable to these peripherally located parasitic army of lobbyists that infest Washington, D.C. And I can tell you, my ex-wife used to work for one of them, and they really can't wait for this Convention of States to pass. So, in short, the amount of hands grasping at the public coffers will not be reduced. And as some recent studies have shown and empirical data suggest, and I think you can look at the NCSL website, they have a very good article about, does term limits take people out of office? No, it doesn't. It doesn't reduce the amount of time people spend in office or in the sphere of influence over politics. What we need to do is to look for a moral solution. And this is what I'm suggesting here today. And I'm not insinuating that anybody here is immoral. and I'm not going to say that. I don't think that we ever intentionally do things wrong, but it's clear that sometimes we don't follow the Constitution, and that's created the problem that we're in today. What we need to, so I say we return to being a people who understand what the government is, and as Thomas Jefferson says, let the people, a fully educated people, be the deposit of liberty in this country, which we don't have. And of course, some people think, and unfortunately, that the government is a giant candy store, and our representatives are the dispensers of goodies like the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus, and that creates problems year after year. Every year, Republicans and Democrats fight over giving voters the things not lawfully allowed by the Constitution, and this behavior has turned every election cycle into a war zone with the American people as victims. This is the very source of our ills, both the people and the elected. Corruption can only be fixed by the electorate voting for moral people, and not those who grant them the most favors. So this isn't just a government problem, this is a people problem, because for all the people that you don't like that are out there holding public office, you have to remember there's somebody that voted for them. And those are the people that don't understand what our Constitution says. So we go in, we get everybody out of the picture, and within a year or another cycle, we'll have the same type of people back in, even if it's just for a short time. So let's start today with every legislator in this room committing to upholding their oath to the Constitution. Stop taking federal money. That'd be a good place to start reducing the size of government. You just have to say no. It's very simple. It says so in the Article 6 of the Constitution. Not required to take all that big federal money that's coming your way. If you want less government, you have to be part of that solution. So, with the participation of our elected officials and the people, we can return ourselves to the place of honor that America was in at one time. And that's all I have to say, and I thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you for your time and for being here. There is a card here from Lucy Everlove. She said she just has written testimony. It is.
I do have it.
Oh, okay. Lucy?
Yeah.
Okay.
My name's Sue, you know.
Well, welcome
Thank you.
from Manchester. Sure. And it doesn't say if you're for or against the measure.
I'm here to speak in favor of the convention at Article 5.
Okay.
And I just want to say a convention is imminent. It's happening. In your lifetime, we're going to have a convention in this country under Article 5 of the Constitution. And legislators met from all across the country, and they were a bipartisan group. They were authorized by their legislative chambers. They were called the Assembly of State Legislators, and they came up with rules. These rules are not binding, but they were proposed by a bipartisan group of legislators. They were negotiated in earnest from the people that were attending. And I do believe that this is the blueprint for what the procedures will be at the convention. So I just wanted to let everybody here on the committee know, those of you who voted for a convention, for other matters, and those of you who voted against in the past, I want you to imagine what a convention looks like when you read these, because I think what it looks like is this chamber. I think it looks like these people sitting in the seats. I think it looks like the committee here before us today. And maybe it'll be here, you know? But imagine what would happen if regular people or legislators, state legislators from across the country got together to talk about seriously, in earnest, and how can we propose amendments to the Constitution to the rest of the states so that they can have a chance and a choice to say whether or not they want that amendment added. So I would encourage you all to think very seriously about the prospect of Article 5. It's in the Constitution, it's there since the beginning. And anyone who opposes this on the grounds of Article 5, on the idea of a convention, I would just ask you, what other parts of the Constitution do you want to ignore? Do you want to ignore the First Amendment? Do you want to ignore the Second Amendment? Or any of the other Bill of Rights? Because the way we got those, like the gentleman mentioned earlier, is by using the convention and applying the pressure to Congress getting them to propose it, and then ratifying them through the states. So this is a state-driven process. You're the legislators that get to decide whether or not this happens. And so we ask you, please consider Article 5 an essential part of the Constitution, an essential check and balance. And remember that there are rules that have been negotiated by most of the legislative bodies and their authorized representatives. And I can give a copy. I only have 3. Sorry, I didn't print enough. But I can give you a copy of these and you can read them. It looks like pretty similar to your rules. So thank you for your time. Any questions?
Are there any questions? If you could get at least one of those copies up here to the clerk, that would be great.
I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay, we still have a few more cards. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I just got Ken Quinn last, so you'll know you're last. Was Ken? Oh, okay, yeah, Ken, so you'll be the, just so you know, you'll be the final speaker. And Eric Stapp is, Eric is here. Welcome. Eric is speaking for the bill for 1 or so minutes, and he's address, I can't quite read that, but Eric, you'll tell us where you're from, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your patience. To sit and listen to all of this all day long is a very tough job, and we all appreciate it. Thank you. I'm Eric Straff, and I'm from Center Harbor. I rise today because I'm 78 years old. I have 5 grandchildren, and I love this nation. That's over $34 trillion in debt. Our federal government is working, even as we speak, to increase the national debt limit so they can run that $34 trillion through the roof. You are the only ones who can fix this problem. You are the ones who call a convention of states. You can choose the delegates from New Hampshire. You can set the rules for the delegates. If a delegate does something wrong, you can recall them. If you will vote for ratification before any proposed amendment becomes law and part of our Constitution. Please remember, too, a convention of states is not a political issue. Democrats have grandchildren. Republicans have children. Independents have children. Undeclared have grandchildren. We're all in this together. One last note, and that is for you representatives, to bear in mind that you are only a small part of the 400 representatives we have in New Hampshire. I hope you will give all of them an opportunity to vote for their children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you for your time and for traveling down here. Would you take any questions if there are any?
Seeing none?
You've been here before. Seeing none, thanks again for coming down here. Terrence Waldron is right there. Terrence from East Kingston, representing himself in favor of the bill.
Deb
In
Hobson.
favor of the resolution, I should say.
I am in favor. Yeah, my name is Terrence Waldron of East Kingston, Rockingham County. Deb Hobson is my representative. And I have 3 pages here, but I think it's going to go down to a couple paragraphs in deference to your request to not repeat. First thing that struck me today, and it's not on my testimony, is the fact that we have Wolfpack here today, U.S. term limits here today, Convention of States here today. We have people from all different political views testifying to you today, saying, we need this. Very interesting. They're coming at it from all different directions, and they're all coming to the same conclusion. I'm an engineer by training. If I have people solve a problem from 2 different directions and they come to the same conclusion, it's probably pretty damn good. Just adding one little note to the whole 31.5 that you have heard all day long. Last year we paid 5% of the national budget for interest. At current interest rates, 4%. That's what T-bills are going, you know, some a little, some above and below. That's going to move to 18% very quickly. Could you imagine what you could do with $1.2 trillion if you weren't paying interest on it? The heart of the matter is the balance of power. Sorry, it's going to be a little choppy because I'm skipping. When the Articles of Confederation were developed, you had about a 90-10 split of power. 10% to the federal government, 90% to the state. Constitution was developed. That rebalanced a bit. 40% federal government, 60% state. Today, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say 10% is left in the state. The federal government is now dominating states, and they're doing it with money. They're borrowing money to control states. You've all seen the funding that has come in. It always comes in with strings. That's how they're doing it. A convention of states allows you to take that federal government and restrain them. Give them some guardrails. Keep them from doing that to you. Pull the power back to yourself. Get it back to a 50-50, something in that range. That's the idea of the convention of states. Put the guardrails in place. On the issue of term limits, I just finished a book that really, it's a story of Billy Bolger and Whitey Bulger. But nested inside that story is the power of Billy Bolger and how Billy Bolger, over years and years and years and years, accumulated that power and became an unstoppable force in Massachusetts politics. Had there been term limits, I don't think Billy would have ever gotten to where Billy got. Think about that. Turning over Congress, turning over the Senate will stop the accumulation of power. The most powerful people in both chambers have been there for quite a while. I'll leave you with that thought. One last item on my thoughts. We spoke about our children. We have a state motto, live free and die. Congress has a motto, live free and pay later. I can't match Mike Ferris and his army of grandkids. I've got 4, but I have the same thoughts as him. We cannot spend today and burden our children with the shackles of debt they can never realize, live free. Another book I read, yes, I read too much history, I apologize. It's a great book called American Rebels. It's the story of the Adams, Quincy, and Hancock family. And there's a thread that goes through that whole book, and that is these were people of action. They saw a problem, they took action, they solved the problem. It took years, it took a lot of sweat, blood, sweat, and tears, but they solved it. And there was a fellow named Joshua Quincy. No one's probably ever really heard of Joshua. Joshua was the Thomas Jefferson of that period. Before the Continental Congresses, Joshua went to every single state. got them on board. They weren't states, sorry, colonies at the time. Joshua went to England. He spent time with Ben Franklin. Joshua died in 1775, coming back from England, consumption. So we lost a great man. But most of the early writings were in Joshua Quincy's pen. And he had a saying that I want to leave you with. It is yourselves must save you, and you are equal to the task. I look at this committee, and that's what I think. It is up to you to save us by changing the direction of the federal government. Put the guardrails on them using Article 5, and I think you're up to the task. Thank you.
Thank you. And seeing, Representative Carey has her hand up, yes.
Do you have a piece of paperwork you might want to submit for the record in your
How about if I
hand?
clean this up and can I submit it by email? Or I can use your website to submit it. Yeah, I'll do that.
Anything else? Thank you again. Joshua McAllister from Manchester has written testimony. Is Joshua here? Okay, I don't know if his written testimony was dropped off or sent electronically. I don't know if he said he had written testimony. Do you know if is he left or do we have his testimony? Okay, if you're in touch with him, you can tell him he can email that to the committee or to my attention, and we'll get that into our record. It doesn't say if he was for or against the measure. Okay, Lisa Crocker from Belmont. Thank you for hanging in, Lisa. You opposed the bill and you asked for 3 minutes. And I call it a bill. It is a resolution technically.
Okay. It's my first time, so bear with me. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. I was very pleased to see so many people show up for this. Like my predecessor said, we are all in this together. My big concern is if the Convention of States is the way to go. It does hold a potential for being very dangerous to our Constitution and our country. This legislation is completely unnecessary, I feel. For example, the facts that term limits have not put anyone at an advantage except lobbyists when looking at term limits history in other states where they have been implemented. Newer elected officials are more vulnerable to be led or misled due to their lack of experience. For perspective, no one asks a lobbyist to be dismissed after 2 to 8 years. They only grow more experienced, and they learn the ins and outs of the system and even develop working relationships with long-term, knowledgeable staffers as the lobbyists are there longer than the elected officials. This gives them a much larger advantage. The frequent turnover of elected officials puts the elected officials at a considerable disadvantage. Term limits can prevent very good elected people from being re-elected and keep them from gaining more insight and experience, which is very counterproductive in turning the current situation around, if that is the hope. In fact, term limits already do exist. It's called voting. Furthermore, to enact term limits would undermine the people's God-given right to choose their representatives. We should also be, should we were to open the Convention of States, we would get rid of our God-given rights recognized in our Constitution. This procedure is how the Articles of Confederation was replaced by our Constitution. There is a precedent here, and therefore it could happen again. Please do not believe the rhetoric stating differently. We could lose the reasons that being an American is wonderful and awesome. We have rights given by God, and no government officials can take these away, take away these protections as long as we have the Constitution. If the concern is about federal government having overreach and the federal government not following the current Constitution, the states can use nullification to stop unconstitutional laws, and honestly, they are under obligation to do so, to protect their citizens. Nullification is a safe way to protect our rights, keep our Constitution, and it has been used multiple times in U.S. history, including in the past few years. If you like, I can bring a few examples to you if you're interested, and I can give you some information as to how the process proceeds. If you are so willing to receive, more information on that subject. My main concern is, it's obvious to everyone that we need a change. My concern is that the COS opens up a lot of risk. I believe that nullification should be used first and foremost. Doesn't mean that a COS may never come to fruition. I'm just a little bit wary of it. Okay, thank you.
Do you have written testimony copy that you'd like to get to the clerk?
I can give you what I just read, but and then I have those pamphlets. That's all I have right now with me.
Well, we do like to keep a folder of testimony if that's presentable. It's up to you.
I can give you this.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and your travel. Larry Gomes from Stark. Okay. Not everyone knows where Stark is. I know where it is, and it's a long ways to the north. Thanks for coming down.
It's about 20 miles north of Mount Washington, Mr. Chairman.
It is in the true North
Country. Thank you for allowing me to testify today. My name is Larry Gomes. I'm a resident of Stark, and over the last few years, our family has been increasingly concerned about the runaway federal deficit, to the point we've been discussing this at Thanksgiving, and I'm not talking just the older members, I'm talking the younger kids too. There is a lot of countries in the world where printing too much money has caused runaway inflation. Just to mention a few: Argentina, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. And in all of these countries, uncontrolled printing led to hyperinflation, which then resulted in the middle class being decimated by food shortages, crime, and economic depression. Think about this: just 30 years ago, Venezuela, which has the largest oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, used to have a standard of living equal to the United States. And now, 9 out of 10 people cannot even feed themselves in that country. And a lot of them are leaving the country. And so we talk about this because could it happen to us? And the answer is yes. So we had almost lost hope until I found out about the Convention of States about a month and a half ago. I didn't even know this existed. And I started reading up what they wanted to do. I read everything I could on Article 5. I watched 8 hours of a mock convention that they put on in Virginia to show how the process would work. And I am convinced that this is a solution that can work versus the other solution, which I don't even want to imagine. And so, as you know, 19 states have passed this resolution, and I respectfully ask this committee to make New Hampshire the 20th state. to make this happen. Give it a chance, let it go, and see where it goes, because the other solution is coming, no matter whether we want it or not. Hyperinflation is here, and it's coming. So I just want to end with the framers knew one day the federal government would overstep their bounds, and they gave us this legal and peaceful way to rein in big government. So I would sincerely ask that you join our family and the thousands of others who are part of this movement to make New Hampshire the 20th state to adopt this resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have your written testimony, which we really appreciate. Does anybody have any questions for Larry? Thank you for coming down from Stark. That is a long drive, and you saw the statue, right? Well, history is important to a lot of us, and I appreciate that you know what you do and you do what you did. Our final speaker, last pink card I have, is for Ken Quinn. We've seen Ken before. Ken, some of us had a presentation from, so he has some background here. Ken, thank you for being the final speaker and hanging in there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, distinguished committee members. My name is Ken Quinn. I am the Regional Director with U.S. Term Limits, and I'm testifying in support of HCR 1. Obviously, because within the scope of this application is Term Limits Amendment for Congress, as well as I want to see the state legislatures utilize their authority under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution to propose needed amendments. I was so encouraged by the number of people that showed up today. That is phenomenal. I just love seeing so many folks who want to see the state legislatures use this authority. And it was great to see Michael Ferris here today as well. He has been a leader of the reawakening of the Article 5 process in our country, and he's been a mentor to me. A little bit of my background, I don't think if I shared it in a previous testimony, but I used to fight that gentleman when he first started this. I used to hand out this DVD produced by the John Birch Society that says, "Beware of Article 5. Ooh, they want you to be scared of the Constitution. Initially I was, until I did my own research. It didn't take me very long to realize, wow, the framers were geniuses. I never knew why they put the convention mode in Article 5 until I actually read why. Funny what happens when you start doing some reading on your own. I immediately realized, wow, this is the mechanism that we need to use. And I called up the Convention of States at that time, and I apologized for opposing them. In fact, I handed out that DVD to the legislators in my state, and I had to apologize for them because once I realized that the information contained in that DVD was nothing but lies, I felt ashamed of myself for spreading them. And I'd like to share something with you, and I want to bring back the spirit of George Washington, because this is nothing new. This is a quote from the father of our country during the ratification of our Constitution, referring to the tactics used by the anti-federalists who were opposing the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Listen to our father. "The opponents, I expected, would endeavor to give it an unfavorable complexion with a view to bias the public mind. This evidently is the case with the writers in opposition, for their objections are better calculated to alarm the fears than to convince the judgment of their readers. They build them upon principles which do not exist in the Constitution, which the known and literal sense of it does not support them in. And this too after being flatly told that they are treading on untenable ground, and after an appeal has been made to the letter and spirit thereof for reproof. And then, as if the doctrine was incontrovertible, draw such consequences as are necessary to rouse the apprehensions of the ignorant and unthinking. It is not in the interest of the major part of these characters to be convinced. I say to you today that this tactic is exactly what is being used against this process. They stand on no constitutional ground. This myth of a runaway convention is nothing but a fear tactic. You cannot read Article 5. You cannot look at our history and believe that stuff. I heard one of your previous testifiers say that James Madison trembled at the thought of this Article 5 convention. The very letter they get that quote from, he describes the two types of conventions. A constitutional convention, which we talked about earlier, which requires unanimous consent to call, and which is what the anti-federalists were seeking at that time. They wanted a redo. He was not referring, that's what he was referring to, that convention, not the 2/3 needed to propose an amendment convention. That he supported. All throughout his life, he was a strong advocate for an Article 5 convention. In fact, one of your own here, Hal Shurtleff, I noticed he left. He wrote this in an article on the Weir's Times, July 22nd, 2021. He says, James Madison, who strongly opposed an Article 5 convention. I can spend hours sharing with you quotes by Madison strongly advocating for an Article 5 convention. He believed in it. And this guy runs something called Camp Constitution. It's unbelievable how they just dishonor the framers. All we have to do is read the debates during the convention when they drafted Article 5. It's clear. It's a limited convention. It's limited to what 2/3 of the states apply for. They voted against giving Article 5 the powers of a constitutional convention. The very first Article 5 application submitted in 1789 by Virginia was for the Bill of Rights. In the debates in Congress, now, this is very powerful. Over 50 members of the first Congress were either framers of our Constitution, or they were delegates to the state ratifying conventions that ratified the Constitution. They well understood Article 5. And when you read the debate in Congress, every single person that spoke on the Virginia application knew we can't do anything until 2/3 apply for the same subject. And then it's out of our hands. And it's out of their hands because they knew Congress has no authority in this matter. They don't choose the delegates. They don't make the rules. It all falls under the states. That is why they gave us the Article 5 convention. The very day on September 15th when they were voting on it, and that's where George Mason stood up, and I'm glad he did. The way it was drafted still allowed Congress to propose the amendments that was applied for by the states. And he said, no, we want them to have no authority whatsoever in this process. The convention is the institutional rival against Congress. Why in the world would the state legislatures want to give them any? It makes absolutely no sense. So this idea that we've heard, in fact, the previous testifier, back to Madison, I highly encourage you to read Federalist 38, because James Madison talks about that second convention that he trembled over, and it's clear he's talking about a constitutional convention that the anti-federalists wanted. It was a complete redo. That's what he's referring to. But a gentleman previously also mentioned a John Birch Society scholar, I laugh at that, by the name of Robert Brown. He goes, and I think you have his testimony. In fact, I think Mr. Matthew Rhodes handed in his testimony. It looked very familiar to me. In that testimony, and what Mr. Brown does is goes around the country. He's offered a $10,000 challenge, and this is his challenge. Find for me one delegate of the Federal Convention of 1787 that stood up and believed they had the authority to propose a new system of government. And he says it doesn't exist. It's on your sheet there. You'll see this. I've answered that challenge over 5 times. He owes me $10,000. I highly recommend, I've got a YouTube channel just for that $10,000. It's called All Things Article 5. I encourage you, please watch my 5 episodes so far requesting the $10,000 payment because I overwhelmingly destroy his lie. It's fear. I'm tired of the fear. This has been mentioned. Why hasn't this continued to get stopped here in this committee? I don't know. All I ask is we stop being fearful. I encourage this committee, in closing, that we stop being afraid of what cannot happen, and be excited about what can happen. Imagine being able to partake and participate in a historic event where you get to propose an amendment that has been the desire of the American people for decades, and an amendment that everybody wants except those in power. Term limits for Congress, simple. 82% of the American people want that. This is federalism. This is the authority the framers gave to you. Now, I just found this quote. I'm going to close in this, because I was studying about this process back in the 90s. Term limits was all the rage. This is an article from 1994. If Congress is truly a representative body which is responsive to the people, then it should propose an amendment to the Constitution limiting congressional terms and present it to the people for ratification. Congress's refusal to do so is the best evidence that it is not the representative body that the framers of the Constitution envisioned, thus giving credence to the argument that the framers would support today's state-imposed congressional term limitation. It is a sad fact that if the states are not allowed to impose congressional term limits, Congress never will, in spite of the will of the people, the supposed ultimate source of power. Members of the committee, this process is because the reason we're here today is because Congress is unresponsive to the American people. These reforms are not going to come from Congress. We're up to, 17 amendments already in 3 weeks in this session in Congress. And some of these are really good amendments, but they're not going to see the light of day unless you step up and put pressure. And once you do, they will start getting in line because they don't want you to do this. They fear you. They fear your power. And that is why we are seeking your support, all of you. I would love to see unanimous consent here. Vote ought to pass on HCR 1. Please, the American people, the people of New Hampshire, and New Hampshire, in my previous testimony, should be leading the charge because you have the experience here in New Hampshire. You sent delegates in 2017 to draft the rules for an Article 5 convention. You have had the most conventions for proposing amendments to your state constitution, proposing over 200 amendments to your own constitution. And you participate annually in an official convention of states known as the Uniform Law Commission. You are doing it well. You are well versed in this process. Do not let the fear mongers influence your decision on this. I close by just want to thank you for allowing so much time today. And I want to thank everyone that showed up, and I want to thank you for seriously considering this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Would you take questions if there are any?
Absolutely.
Representative Carey.
So you said they fear us. So is this like the atomic bomb of democracy?
No, this is the way government should work.
Other questions? Sina, thank you, Ken, for all your time, and thank everyone else who has stayed through a memorable afternoon. We have a lot of material here, and again, thanks for your time and your travel. And we will have an executive session on this a week from today. And some of you know the process. Whatever comes out of committee will go to the full House in some fashion. We don't know what it'll be yet, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
All right, you have been watching a hearing of the New Hampshire Committee on State, Federal Relations, and Veteran Affairs in consideration of our Article 5 Convention of States legislation, and it was titled HCR 1. We are expecting our president and co-founder of Convention of States, Mark Meckler, to be joining us in just a few minutes. But I'm going to do a quick recap before he joins us. The resolution was introduced by J.D. Bernardi. The bill also had 8 legislative co-sponsors. At least 2 of those co-sponsors gave proponent testimony today. Michael Ferris, he was there to give expert testimony, and he really started out right out the gate talking about his credentials, talking about how he had litigated Article 5 issues in the courts in the past. He brought up the fact that he had a law article that was in the Harvard Review Journal, and he talked about how his 1787 journal really quashes the theory that the 1787 convention ran away. And he gave such an eloquent synopsis of the 1787 convention. He did it in a very succinct way as well. And then he came at the very end of that and said, "You're not a constitutionalist if you believe that the Constitution was illegally adopted." So it was such a great testimony given by our own Michael Ferris. And that was followed by testimony from several proponents that were state representatives. And then we had, of course, our Grassroots give just a very thought-provoking testimony as well. Several of our Convention of States supporters and volunteers showed up, and they talked about why Convention of States is so important to them, why they believe this resolution is the solution that is going to change the course of American history. It was just amazing to see all of them joining us or joining their fellow supporters of Convention of States. So we have Mark Meckler, who's going to be joining us in just a moment. Actually, here he is. Here's Mark. Mark, I want to get your recap on what you actually. I want to start with Michael Ferris, because you, that's one of your friends. He is the co-founder of Convention of States. He's come back as a senior advisor to Convention of States. You were with him in North Carolina, and now he was in New Hampshire to give testimony. Can you just give your kind of your reaction to seeing him give testimony in this committee?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's a lot attached to that. I mean, obviously, Michael's one of the leading experts in the country, in the world, on Article 5. He's written extensively on it. He wrote the most extensive piece and the absolutely definitive piece in the Harvard Review of Law and Business, debunking that the idea that the 1787 convention was a runaway. He talked about that. For me, it's also kind of an emotional thing, because it takes me back almost 10 years, August of 2013, when we founded Convention of States. And when I was with Mike in North Carolina last week, one of the things I was joking about is I was remembering back to my very first legislative testimony 9 years ago or so in Montana. And I remember getting ready to walk into the legislature. I actually had my daughter Lucy with me at the time. I was getting ready to walk in, and I remember calling Mike on the phone to ask him, "Hey, when I go into committee, what do I refer to these guys as?" Like, I'd never testified. Is it your honor? I don't know what to say. And he laughed at me because, of course, he'd been doing it for many years, and he coached me And he coached me a lot along the way. I learned so much about what I do in a legislature, or even when I'm giving a speech about Convention of States. I learned that from Mike Ferris, somebody who's been doing this literally at the level of the Supreme Court and in legislative testimony in states around the country and in the federal government for decades. And so I feel like I learned at the feet of one of the best in the country. And so seeing him sitting there, all that stuff kind of flashes in front of me. And then I just listened to him, and he's as eloquent as ever, as genteel as ever, as educated as anybody you can imagine in the country on the Constitution and specifically on Article 5 of the Constitution. So I was just really proud to have him back. I was really emotional to see him back there from a personal perspective, and also really thrilled for the organization to know that it's not just me on the road anymore. And then it was me and Rick Santorum. Obviously, we had Senator Tom Coburn, who he lost his battle to cancer a couple of years ago. That was a great loss for the organization. So then we add Rick, and it's me and Rick. And this is the first time in the organization's history that we've had three what I would describe as keynote speakers, or three what we call traveling experts or headliners. And that does a couple of things. I mean, one is it takes a tremendous burden off of me. When it's just me, I mean, as you can imagine, that's just rough. I can't be everywhere at once. We've got a lot of stuff going on this year in a lot of legislatures. And so then you add Rick, and it made it much easier on me. And Rick traveled a lot last year, and he's already traveling this year. To add Mike Ferris into that mix, man, it's just a power play. I think to have the three of us, have three headliners like this, it allows us to be in a lot of different places at once. We're going to be all over the place next week. I'm now going to be in Cheyenne, Wyoming for committee testimony, and then going to Idaho for a town hall meeting. I just feel like it demonstrates the growth and the power of COS. So I would start with that. Really proud of the organization and proud to have Mike Ferris back.
Mm-hmm. Mark, so this was a very long committee hearing. It's about 3 hours. You talked about Michael Ferris and his testimony. There was also some testimony from J.D. Bernardi, who is the primary sponsor. There was testimony from several other representatives, and there was also testimony from our grassroots. What are some of the highlights or things that stood out to you during this hearing?
I mean, one thing is, and I'll be honest with you, I'm surprised by the amazing grassroots turnout. Our grassroots are always good. I mean, if we have 1 or 2 or 5, it's always good. Our regional director, Haley Shaw, reported we had roughly 50 grassroots there. That's a big number in any legislature. But I want you to think about what a small state New Hampshire is. To have 50 grassroots show up there, that is an extraordinary thing, and much bigger than I expected. So I'm super proud of our leadership there, super proud of our past regional director there, Susan Peters, who's phasing out, and Haley Shaw coming in, getting her first taste of what that's like. Man, she must have been blown away, because I was blown away. And then the next thing I want to add, well, I think that our testimony is always good. Every year it gets better. And every year I'm kind of blown away by it. Back in the early days, we used to go in, nobody knew exactly what they were going to say. Nobody was coached. There wasn't a lot of planning. Now, if you notice, we go in, people make sure they're not repeating each other. Everybody has their own angle on what they're going to say. Excuse me. I feel like they're extraordinarily well trained. I've watched a lot of hearings over the years, not just on our stuff, but on others. I don't think there, and I can say this absolutely with confidence, there definitely isn't another grassroots organization in the country that can put 50 people in a legislature that are going to testify this well. So there's a lot of highlights, but the main highlight is everybody overall and how good they were.
So then what's going to happen next for New Hampshire? We had this hearing. What's the next step? When do you think we'll get a vote out of this committee?
So the last thing I want to say, though, about testimony before we move on is Ken Quinn used to work for Convention of States. And if you didn't see the close, I hope you saw the close. I hope we got that recorded, because that's one of the best closes I've ever heard in my life. And Ken has spent years becoming an expert on Article 5. He's an expert on the John Birch Society and what a scam they are. I mean, he's somebody who's been personally inside the John Birch Society. He knows what a scam they are. He's completely debunked everything they've said. Robert Brown offers this $10,000 reward. I think it is very clear that he is owed that $10,000 reward, and I'm glad he's going after it. Robert Brown owes him $10,000 at this point. And so I'm just really proud he came out of COS. He's doing a great job out there on his own, leading his own branch of the Article 5 movement. So great job to Ken Quinn. So what the committee said, and this is not unusual in a committee hearing, they vote in what's called executive committee. And that means I don't love this, by the way, but this is the way they do it. They go behind the scenes. They'll have a private meeting among the committee members, and that's where they cast their votes. And usually they don't reveal exactly what everybody's votes were. Some legislatures do. I'm not sure exactly about New Hampshire, but they said on February 3rd, so that's next week, February 3rd, I think it's Friday, they'll do an exec committee vote behind the scenes, and they'll decide whether this is a do pass or do not pass recommendation, and it'll either come out of committee or it won't. I'm hopeful. I mean, I can't tell you that I know the votes, but certainly what we saw today is that the testimony was overwhelmingly in support. And we heard groups that are not aligned with COS recommending do pass. And I think that was pretty interesting. You don't usually see that. So I think we have a very good chance of getting out of this committee.
Mm-hmm. To your point, Mark, I think I only heard one or two opponents that were just citizens. The other opponents were people who were representatives who were there voicing their opposition. I want to bring up one person who was an opponent, or sorry, a proponent for Convention of States, and he had a moving story. And he was talking about how he's 75 years old and how he has grandchildren and how the debt is just unbelievable to him, and that in the coming years, the debt will go from 31 trillion to 34 trillion and beyond. And he said something that was really quite moving, I thought, to the committee. He said, please give the rest of the legislature an opportunity to vote on this legislation. I thought it was very moving. And, you know, I'm wondering if you could give a call to action right now for any person who's in New Hampshire and who's watching this right now. What can they do to help make this our Article 5 application get out of committee and go to a full floor vote?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I mean, one is if you live in the district of any of these committee members, call the committee member, email the committee member. Call is the best, by the way. Call them and let them know you want them to vote, do pass, that you want this out of committee and going to the floor. And I thought that clarion call that you said that grandfather gave, and I apologize, I don't remember his name, was really valuable, which is please just let this get to the floor. Let there be a full debate. Let the citizens of New Hampshire debate this out through their representatives. And one of the things that drives me the most crazy is we know how much support there is in every state for this. We know the thousands upon thousands of petition signers, and then they dismiss it occasionally in committee like, yeah, we're not even going to let you talk about this. And I take great offense from that. I think that the citizens of New Hampshire deserve that debate. So if you're in any of those districts, call those committee members. If you're not in those districts, if you're in another district in New Hampshire, call your rep and tell them to put pressure on the committee to get it to the floor, that you want to see them debate this. You want to see this voted on. New Hampshire is an incredibly unusual legislature based on its size. It's, I think, the second largest legislative body in the United States of America. Average district there, I believe, last I looked, was around 3,300 people. It operates as a true citizen legislature. The way that legislatures were intended to operate by the founders, I think they get paid, they're pretty highly paid there. I think they get paid $100 a year. I'm not kidding. And I think that was said in like 1789 or something, and it's never changed. And so these are true public servants that come to that legislature to serve. They represent very small groups of people, so it's really representative. I want to see this debated on the floor. I know you all want to see it debated on the floor. That's the pressure we have to put on them. Give a do pass recommendation, get it out of committee and onto the floor.
All right, Mark, I got one last question before we let you go. Yeah. You mentioned how Mike Ferris has come on as a senior advisor. We have Senator Rick Santorum as a senior advisor as well. All three of you are going out to state legislatures across the country and testifying on behalf of Convention of States. Where can our supporters, where are they going to see you go next?
So me personally, on Tuesday, I'll be testifying in Cheyenne. And so I'm pretty excited by going back to Cheyenne. I haven't been back there in a while. And we have a committee hearing there in Cheyenne that I'll be testifying at. And then I will, the following day, Wednesday, I will fly out to Idaho. And we're doing a town hall in Boise, Idaho. So I'm really excited about that. Rick Santorum will be joining me. Local talk show host Kevin Miller, radio personality, will be hosting us there. So I'm excited about that. Idaho looks pretty good this year, and it's always been a rough state for us. You know, and I want to make one more comment, which is I think you hear about the John Birch Society, and JBS as they're known for short. I call them JBS. It's important that you do that in the right sequence. And here's the thing to know about JBS, because we're going to face them in Idaho, we'll face them in Cheyenne. They slander us the way that they've always slandered other conservatives. They have a long history of this. They were chased out of the conservative movement by William F. Buckley, the very founder of the conservative movement in the United States of America. He was joined by Barry Goldwater, the first presidential standard bearer running for president as a conservative. They were chased out of the movement by Ronald Reagan. And those three guys told us, look, these people are crazy and they will pollute and destroy the conservative movement if we don't chase them out. So I'm really sad that they're still around and we're still fighting that. But we are, and we're winning, and we look good in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. We beat them last year in their home state of Wisconsin. That's where they're based, in Wisconsin. And they literally had zero impact in their own home state where they're based. So they're losing ground. And so just know that when you hear from those folks, this is not a legitimate source of information. They're completely dishonest. They've been debunked by Ken Quinn. Go to Ken Quinn's YouTube page or Facebook page and watch all these things. You find out what they're really about. And then the best thing you can do is come out and support us. I look forward to seeing you in Cheyenne or in Boise, Idaho. I'll be in both those places, and I'm continuing to travel in the weeks following.
All right, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to get some inspiration from you and hear where you're going to be traveling. We hope to have you back after another hearing sometime in the near future. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for doing it.
All right, and thank you to all of you for joining us today and watching that incredible hearing. It was great to see the Grassroots, great to see so many patriots show up in support of Convention of States and our Article 5 resolution. If you get in the game, if you're ready to take action and become a volunteer, please go to conventionofstates.com, take action, sign up as a district captain, a volunteer activist, or whatever skill set you have. We can use it to help grow the Grassroots Army to get to an Article 5 Convention of States. We need you in the game and active. Your country needs you. We need you. Thank you for watching this amazing hearing. We'll see you at the next hearing, or we'll see you at the next Facebook Live. Until then, we have a country